Hi, I'm Stephen Prince. Masaki Kobayashi was at the peak of his career when he made Kwaidan. Kobayashi was known for hard-edged, contemporary films of social criticism. Kwaidan, though, is the second in a series of 3 period films that he made in succession, and his interests in social criticism take a back seat in this movie, although they are not completely gone. In Kwaidan, he wanted to embrace and celebrate Japan's traditional aesthetic heritage. During the war years of the 1930s and 1940s, the militarists and ultra-nationalists had co-opted the arts and their traditions and used them for nefarious purposes. In Kwaidan, Kobayashi aims to reclaim the arts from this dark period. We're seeing a longer version of the movie that was not released overseas. As we go along, I will point to some of the differences between the various versions. This credit sequence is quite remarkable with its interplay of form and formlessness, the clarity of the kanji characters contrasting with the dissolution of the colored ink in water. This contrast points to the thin membrane between the material and the spiritual world, between body and soul, between life and death, between the rational and the irrational, which Kobayashi aimed to explore and illustrate. Accompanying the images are sounds produced by clusters of bells being struck. The film's music and sound effects are by Toru Takemitsu. Each bell sound decays into a silence that persists for an interval that is known as ma. Sound and silence exchange energy, defining each other in what Takemitsu described as a metaphysical continuity that defies analysis. The powerful silence of ma gives life to the sound, which in turn yields its position to the surrounding silence. The relationship epitomizes Takemitsu's ideal of sound in the Japanese tradition, which he described as the nothingness of wind in a bamboo grove. Takemitsu was Japan's premier composer, best known internationally for a concert work entitled November Steps that counterposed traditional Japanese instruments, biwa and shakuhachi, with a Western symphony orchestra. The 2 musical traditions are not blended but are set into dialogue with each other. Takemitsu wrote nearly 100 movie scores, and he and Kobayashi collaborated on 10 films. Kobayashi said that his movies had too much music until he began working with Takemitsu, whose method was to parse music and sound to an absolute minimum. Kwaidan is their 3rd collaboration, and Takemitsu's work is a major influence on the film and on what a viewer experiences while watching it. So we'll be spending some time talking about Takemitsu's extraordinary work on this picture. Just as striking as the music and sound effects in Kwaidan are its cinematography and art direction. Kobayashi's cinematographer is Yoshio Miyajima, a communist and staunch unionist who had made several wartime propaganda movies and then teamed with the resolutely anti-militarist Kobayashi on The Human Condition and Harakiri. As a prominent auteur, Kobayashi at this time had a repertory company on set in many of the technical departments for this production. So as we come to the end of this opening credit sequence, Kobayashi will begin the film with a series of traveling camera shots. In the first one, when the gates open, instead of moving through them, the camera will crane up and over this gated wall into a bird's eye view of the courtyard. This high-angle view is one that Kobayashi often uses in his movies, and it relates directly to his personal experiences. When he was young and living at home and felt poorly or depressed, he would climb the mountains that rimmed the port city of Otaru, and the height was calming and soothing. He remarked several times throughout his life that his preference for high camera angles stemmed from these experiences. But as well, in Kwaidan, the high angle will be used to evoke the singular bird's eye perspective that is commonly found in the compositions of the Emakimono, the 12th century narrative picture scrolls. Kobayashi will cite these explicitly in the film's 3rd episode about Hōichi the Earless, and they are one of the aesthetic traditions that he wanted to embrace in Kwaidan. So we get a lot of very sensual, sinuous moving camera shots that take us into the film, and they showcase the unconventional approach to sound that Kobayashi and Takemitsu practice. The images of the deserted mansion explicitly connote sound information. Bushes are rustling in the breeze, but there are no sound effects that accompany those visual markers. Instead, Takamitsu uses single sounds, produced by creaking bamboo and a prepared piano, placed at deliberately spaced intervals so that these silences create a metaphysical charge, binding the isolated pieces of audio. The use of prepared piano derives from the work of John Cage, who was a major influence on Takamitsu. By placing objects like screws or bolts or pennies or bits of wool in the piano strings, the sound of the instrument can be radically altered. So effective is Takamitsu at this that it's often hard to tell in the movie what it is, what kind of sound source we're hearing. Many of the film's sounds have been electronically altered, which adds further to the mystery. By confounding our audio perception and by playing with the synchronization of picture and sound, Kobayashi and Takamitsu point to a presence, a force beyond and behind the surfaces of the material world. Cameras photograph the appearance of things. Traditional Japanese aesthetics has not valued the appearance of things. Motokyo Zeami, the great theorist of no drama, wrote that appearances are to be despised in art, so Kobayashi is intent on going well beyond these, and therefore in this movie, realism as a style is wholly rejected. The movie is an anthology of short stories. While these stories had been part of a long oral tradition, the movie credits them to Lafcadio Hearn, a writer known in the West. This decision possibly is part of an attempt to broaden the film's appeal and enhance its marketability overseas. But I think there's another reason for the spotlighting of Hearn. Kobayashi identified two individuals who were extremely influential on his professional development. Izu Yaichi was one, Keisuke Kinoshita, the filmmaker, was the other. Yaichi was a student of Hearn at Waseda University, the university that Kobayashi in turn would attend. Kobayashi's original plan in life was to become an art historian, but he felt that with World War II underway and the probability that he would be drafted, he didn't feel that he would have sufficient time to master that field. As a result, he became a filmmaker. It was a quicker way to have an effect on the world. But he felt very indebted to Yaichi for the love for ancient art that he derived from studying under him. Hearn was an expatriate who was born in Greece, lived in Ireland, France, the West Indies, New Orleans, and in Japan for the last 14 years of his life. He fell in love with Meiji-era Japan, married a Japanese woman, converted to Buddhism, and changed his name to Koizumi Yakumo. He could not read or speak Japanese, and the collections of stories that he wrote about ghosts and other strange things derived from oral and written sources, which were translated by his wife. He died in 1904, and many of his writings about the people and places he had visited provide an important historical record of Japan in this era. Fans of the film who are interested in Hearn can find this episode, titled The Reconciliation, in Hearn's book Shadowings, which was first published in 1900. Kobayashi gives us a slightly elevated angle. It's a kind of smaller variation on the high-angle views that he likes to employ. The aristocratic nature of the samurai's new appointment is evident in the fashion on display, especially the tall eboshi hat worn by the elder lord and the plucked or shaven eyebrows of the new wife. This custom of removing the eyebrows and painting new ones higher on the forehead in ink developed in the Heian period when aristocratic and court life assimilated many Chinese influences and became quite ornamented and refined. This sequence is unusual because it opens with the kind of natural ambient sounds, water and wind, and with effects that are synchronized to the image that we typically hear in movies, and that this film often ignores and abandons. Now here's a fabulous composition, the way that Kobayashi uses the trees to bisect the horizontal widescreen frame in multiple places. The film's title, Kwaidan, the W in the title reflecting an effort at transliteration, designates tales of the strange and mysterious. These are not horror stories in the modern or Western sense, but instead are brief tales of odd events or encounters with ghosts or spirits. The stories mostly do not have a psychological focus, nor do they contain a moral lesson the way that no drama does. Instead, the focus is on the strange or uncanny. And because the stories are not really about personality or morality, Kobayashi must move in a different direction here from where he usually has been as a dramatist. So he goes into aesthetic tradition and into an avant-garde approach to picture and sound in order to evoke the uncanny. This term, Kwaidan, originates in the early Edo period, the 17th century, when the development of printing shifted these stories from an oral to a written tradition. Printed collections of Kwaidan were tremendously popular as sources of entertainment in the Edo period, and these printed versions probably are where Lafcadio Hearn encountered most of them. The presence of the narrator in these tales points to their origin in an oral tradition. There are no ambient environmental sounds in this marketplace scene, in spite of the obviously bustling activity. Instead, we hear very dry noises produced by the prepared piano, which become a motif for the new wife. As I noted earlier, it's often difficult to identify all of the sounds that Takamitsu is creating, and there may be a lute being plucked along with the piano in this sequence. Takamitsu was very fond of John Cage and his experiments with music. So now the new wife, when she smiles, we will see her blackened teeth. There we go. The practice of blackening teeth went under various names: ohaguro, fushimizu. Dyeing the teeth black was regarded as a sign of beauty and was something that married or aristocratic women did until the Meiji era, when Western cultural influences began to percolate through Japan. Now look at this. Notice how the overlap of the samurai and the first wife is held for an interval before the dissolve is completed. Rustling bamboo sounds join the prepared piano as the camera cranes into the first wife at her loom. And then we cut to a similar crane down to the samurai in the market square as the eerie audio effects create a sound bridge. Kobayashi has gracefully moved into a poetic sequence showing the samurai's desire and subjectivity. Then he bursts into the room and we have this diagonal arcing camera move as he enters the room. A reverse angle cut and a traveling camera combined with a zoom here take us toward the first wife at her loom. She stands, smiles, and we cut back to the samurai with a desolate expression on his face. Kobayashi's fluid camera has moved across the series of 5 shots in a way that visualizes the character's trajectory of desire, and also what Freud called the omnipotence of thought, the way that desire and belief can transcend time and space and reimagine the circumstances of one's life. The scene is a type of flashback, not to a real time and place, but to a remembered desire, a recollection of what once was and is now wished for. Flashbacks have been tremendously important narrative devices for Kobayashi in his films, and often he uses them to counterpoint desire with the harsh restriction of social authority or political systems. In the next moment, we're going to see a great shot. It's this shot of the wife in bed, which is a very explicit instance in the film where Kobayashi imitates the oblique perspective of the Emakimono picture scrolls. The characteristic bird's eye view in those scrolls provides an exploded view of the interiors of buildings and rooms, rather like what we had there with the wife glimpsed between the edges of the foreground screens. In the scrolls, oblique perspective creates a more two-dimensional presentation than the Western method of trying to imitate receding parallel lines. Linear perspective in the Western tradition situates the viewer in a specific place of observation relative to the pictured composition. Oblique perspective does not. As used in the picture scrolls, it allows for the simultaneous presentation of multiple views of an action or event, and the viewer seems to float above the scene without being anchored to a specific place as in linear perspective. So the samurai has an out-of-body projection as he visits the old home, and when he knocks over this stand, there's a conspicuous lack of synchronous sound, part of the audiovisual experimentation that Kobayashi and Takamitsu are doing throughout the movie. Most all of this film is shot in a vast indoor soundstage that Kobayashi had converted from a former military barracks, which is rather ironic given his complicated feelings about the military. But it allows him to get these kinds of really stylized looking landscapes, where it's a sort of projection of a kind of uncanny world. The archery sequence, shot outdoors, explicitly returns us to the world of ambient sound tied to particular sources on screen. But only to an extent, because a lot of these audio effects, like the horse's hooves pounding on the ground, seem both exaggerated and artificial. The audio of the hooves, for example, carries a marked reverberation as if it's occurring within an enclosed space, which is not true to what we are seeing. And the sounds of the breaking targets hit by arrows resemble very closely the effects that Takamitsu produces in the film with lengths of bamboo, and later in this episode with breaking wood. So I think there's a kind of subtle dislocation even here between what we see and what we hear. And that dislocation marks the images, especially the low-angle shots of the samurai at gallop and sighting the target. Now, these kinds of shots, where the camera pivots around the Z-axis, are the most extreme optical distortions that we've seen in the film thus far, and they're accompanied by sounds from prepared piano. They represent the samurai's haunted obsessions with the first wife. Kobayashi will do more of these Z-axis rotations, particularly in the last episode of the movie. And he's done these kinds of shots before, in Harakiri, and even in his earliest films, such as Sincerity and The Thick-Walled Room. He used various kinds of optical distortions and strange camera perspectives to capture a subjective view of obsessions and desires. These interludes in Kwaidan, then, are not new explorations for Kobayashi. In fact, he has long been interested in the connections between the world of surface appearance and more transcendent domains of fantasy, obsession, guilt, and desire. The spiritual domain of experience is very important for Kobayashi, and it always has been. All these qualities are working on the samurai in this section of the episode, and the pirouetting camera perfectly captures the flux of emotion that engulfs him. Now, that cut that we've just had to the wife's indolent yawn is a great transition. The high-angle view we get here, again, is very like what one sees in the narrative scrolls, with the lines of architecture inclining at oblique angles approximating the parallel perspective that we see in those paintings. And even though Kobayashi is photographing a set with spatial depth, the high-angle and diagonal framing works to minimize perspective and emphasize surface design, taking us closer to a 2D rather than a 3D presentation. The rustle of the silk kimono on the wood floor is one of the few relatively realistically presented sound effects in the movie. 旦那様にはまだご所見の模様。 When she kneels down to her husband and he pushes her away, that gesture is so expressive of contempt that if he wasn't already in trouble with the spirit of his dead first wife, he'd certainly be in trouble when this wife left the world. When we get the reaction shot here, her stony face with its painted eyebrows is like a no mask. Takamitsu has used the sound of breaking ice with the action of closing the fan before striking him with it. The camera move when she leaves and walks into the rear of the set does give us a pronounced depth effect that is rather different from the earlier compositions that I've noted. So first she has to vent her scorn. Now she leaves, and the camera moves into the space of the set. And that calls attention to the volume of space that's there. It creates a depth effect that's a little bit contrary to the way much of the design works. And the same is true here. When we move toward the samurai in this rather open-spaced set. The percussive sounds from the prepared piano and an electronically modified sound source keep us a little bit on edge. Kobayashi films and cuts along a diagonal separating the samurai from one of the attending staff, and the compositions make use of a conventional Z-axis depth. Here you see the out-of-focus foreground objects and then the cut here to the diagonal. Both characters at opposite ends of the frame, accentuating the distinction between background and foreground. Kobayashi, though, will counter this conventional perspective with the anti-realist elements in the art direction, especially the painted backing or translight representing the clouds and sky that you can see up there in the rear of the frame. So it's an interesting mix of elements, right? Conventional depth perspective mixed with obviously anti-realistic effects that themselves call attention to the painted surface of a flat display. A crane down from on high returns us to the old home as the samurai, dressed in aristocratic finery, comes back at last. Of course, things have changed now. The passage of time is quite evident in the fact that everything is wild and overgrown. And as he walks through the grounds, we're not going to hear any environmental sounds. Instead, Takamitsu uses the noise of wood cracking and breaking. When first heard, it falls on no identifiable beat of the action. And the intent is to keep the viewer off guard by preventing our ability to anticipate when the noise will appear, or really even what it is. So on the one hand, there's a kind of interesting ambiguity that gets played with here. Much of what we're seeing on screen involves rotting wood, right? And the samurai is going to be breaking through portions of the floor. But the sounds that we're hearing on screen don't exactly or even always correspond to the action that's occurring visually. The wood breaking noises are used as music cues in the sequence. So sometimes what we're hearing is related to what's happening on screen. At other times, it's working in a more metaphorical fashion as a kind of musique concrète, again, an influence from John Cage. Kobayashi catches the action with the kind of sensuously moving camera that he employs throughout the movie. And he gives us a rather lengthy build-up to the encounter with what turns out to be the spirit of the now dead first wife. The samurai moving through the grounds, the cruel effects of time apparent in the way that things have decayed. The camera traveling with him in a way that captures the action and also plays to the size of the set. Kobayashi can reveal the vastness of the set, the decor, the details, and the and the lighting and color design as the camera prowls through the grounds. It was Takamitsu's idea to use these ripping sounds as a principal cue in this section of the episode. And such was Kobayashi's respect for the composer that he deferred to his judgment that avoiding real sounds was the way to go, building the soundtrack out of the encounter between discrete sounds and silences. And again, these silences, these spaces between sounds, are not intended to be dead or empty. Their intervals also are calculated. They are units of ma informing our experience. Ripping sounds are used to signify the presence of the ghost of the first wife. While these are very innovative, there may be a precedent for them in kabuki theater, where ghostly presences are marked musically. A 1956 version of the play Leaf Viewing Party, for example, used ripping noises to mark the appearance of a female ghost demon. These noises were produced by scraping two bronze hand gongs together. Takamitsu was very conversant in the arts, and he may very well have had this production in mind when he thought about how to convey in this episode of the movie the presence of the dead first wife. Now we're back into the realm of ambient sounds, natural sounds that are connected to sources on screen. These suggest that we have entered fully into the domain of the spirit. The illusion of normality, in other words, is complete. The samurai does not suspect that he has crossed a threshold from this world to the next. The apparent realism of the sound design denotes this illusion. Kobayashi holds a series of compositions using the posts to divide the widescreen frame and to separate the characters. It points to their differences as material and spiritual beings. In this close shot of the samurai, again, he's enclosed in compositional spaces that are constrained and limited. There's an insert close-up of the wife. She sits down, and then we go to this wide shot that again stresses their distance from one another. So he confesses that he's made an error and that she ought to hate him, and indeed, evidently she does, because the story turns into a tale about an angry ghost. That is a significant revision of the Lafcadio Hearn version of the story, which does not include the terrible vengeance that the ghostly wife wreaks on her husband. Indeed, all of the four stories in the film are tales of angry ghosts, and Kobayashi might have relied on this motif as a way to create an underlying unity and structure across the various episodes. Otherwise, this version of the story sticks closely to Hearn's plotting. Now, the wife appears to forgive him, which sets up the uncanny twist in the tale when it becomes clear that she hasn't. Often in Kwaidan, the main character does not realize until the end of a story that he's been the target of malice or mischief. The angry ghost often initially appears to the protagonist as a normal person, and the story produces a feeling of the uncanny by revealing the ghost and the danger that threatens the character. So the camera and the characters are gradually drawing closer together. Composition still gives us a little spatial separation between them. But the samurai is so fully repentant now that he can believe that his wife has forgiven him, and he can believe that he's able to step back into his life as it had been. It's a pretty seductive act that this angry ghost is putting on, because it really does draw him back to her. So they come together, and when he takes her hand, we get a new audio source that points to the other world. It's the sound of breaking ice, electronically modified to enhance its strangeness. The samurai promises her that they'll always be together across 7 successive lives, and she lowers her head to his chest, an action that the viewer might expect to elicit an audio cue, but it doesn't. Takamitsu avoids the obvious markers. Instead, it's when Kobayashi pans slowly along the length of her black hair that we hear the ice sound once more. And the hair assumes an importance that is much greater than in the Hearn iteration of the tale. Kobayashi is very good about matching shots and continuity of action. He doesn't break continuity very often, but we've got a really striking instance coming up here. Note the way the composition changes when we cut to the next shot. The samurai here is facing screen right, and when we go into the cut, we're going to flip the position of the characters because the camera positions have crossed the line of action. This cut, therefore, stands out. It works as another way to indicate the presence of the uncanny. Time and place are not what they seem to the samurai. The frame is bisected by that post there toward the right. It entraps the samurai, encloses him in a small compositional space. And the transition that comes up now to the marital bed is going to be marked with more sounds of breaking ice. This section of the story is rather poignant, and it conveys the sense of mutability that is deeply embedded in Japanese aesthetics. A sense of how transient and fleeting life is, how brief are our pleasures and our happiness, how inevitable are loss and decay. So many of the arts reflect this outlook. As I noted, Kobayashi had studied art and literature when he was a university student, and so he understands the place that mutability must have in the aesthetic styles and emotions that the film evokes. So he's very careful to evoke it here in this episode. And this element is much stronger than it appears in the Hearn story.
間もなく夜も明けまする。
この部屋も懐かしい。そなたと初めて契りを結んだ。
When she crosses over to him, Kobayashi is going to front light them in a way that throws strong shadows on the rear wall. In fact, you can see the strong shadow that the samurai is casting there. This creates an interesting tension with Kobayashi's aesthetic objectives in the movie, because this kind of modeling in light is very common in cinema, and it strikes the viewer as something that's very familiar. It's worth pointing out that, in fact, this kind of modeling in light is very foreign to the art traditions that Kobayashi explores in the film. Japanese painting, for example, did not use light to model three-dimensional figures the way that Western traditions have done. It was not a mimetic art. It was concerned more with surface than with modeling in light and shade. There's another very conventional kind of shot where we've got the modeling of light and shade. So the optics of a camera lens have constrained Kobayashi's ability to simulate parallel perspective, and in a like way, he has to be judicious in the way that his representation of surfaces stays within the traditions of lighting that have been normative in cinema. Almost everything in the film is shot on indoor sets, and a series of lighting changes signifies the approach of dawn. The lighting in the film is often very theatrical. The Lafcadio Hearn story ends with the samurai's discovery that his wife has been a ghost. There is no vengeance element, and the tale finishes with a sense of melancholy and the uncanny. The grotesque extension that we have now, in which the hair of the corpse attacks the samurai, derives from other folkloric elements about vengeful or jealous demon women. Some can detach their heads from their body and creep about at night, causing mischief. Others can turn their hair into snakes that attack and devour their prey. Hearn alluded to these stories in an essay that he wrote about women's hair, most of which discussed matters of fashion, hair care, and ornamentation. Kobayashi has given the episode its last act by drawing from these more grotesque elements of folklore. Takamitsu does not catch the action using a sonic cue at any of the expected places. When the samurai reacted in horror at what he sees, for example, and subsequently when we saw the shot of the skull with the hair attached, there was no audio cue. Instead, in this extraordinary overhead view, when the samurai falls to the floor, the sound of breaking wood appears after the action. Again, this is Kobayashi's signature high-angle shot. That's, in fact, the most extreme version that we've seen in the movie. These high-angle shots are ones that Kobayashi has identified as a core element of his personal style, and they assume a number of functions in his movies. Sometimes they express the presence of a spiritual perspective, a kind of Buddha looking down on the world. At other times, they can express the machinations of social power and can convey the sense of oppressive circumstances. So it's really a multivalent visual perspective that he employs. Now, Takamitsu has added a new sonic element, which supplements the ripping sounds of breaking wood with a low, eerie wailing noise produced by a string instrument, a bow passing along the strings, the sound being slowed down and otherwise altered so that it becomes unnerving and grating. This is a really wonderful shot here. The camera moves into this corridor and executes a Z-axis pivot so that the world becomes unglued and it lurches in this really unnerving fashion. Kobayashi uses this kind of Z-axis pivot throughout his career, and we're going to see a lot of that in the last episode of this film. The samurai is undergoing changes. He seems to be aging at an accelerated rate. As the sequence progresses, his hair begins to decay and fall out. It's as if the ravages of time that had seemed to be held in abeyance when he thought that he could re-enter his old life are now being unleashed upon him, perhaps by the vengeful spirit of his first wife. There's a good shot that shows the decay that's being visited upon him. It almost makes him look a little demonic. Now he's working his way toward this well, and we get this shot here, the reflected image. In the short 120-minute version of the movie that played in the United States in 1965, this is where the episode ended. There was a freeze frame on the reflection of the samurai's face in the water. In my opinion, it made for a very effective and rather shocking end to the episode. It's a significantly different ending because what it tells us is that he never gets outside of the haunted and dilapidated house, whereas in this more extended version here, he does get outside. In my mind, keeping him in the house suggests a deeper level of entrapment and doom than what we're seeing in the longer version, where he does break free and goes outside, only to be attacked again by the hare. So that's a difference in the versions of the film. There's also less imagery of the demonic hare behaving in an aggressive way in the shorter 120-minute cut of the movie. So Kobayashi ends the tale there with this freeze frame, suspending time and space forever within the realm of the demonic. This episode about the snow woman, Yukionna, did not appear at all in the short version of the film released theatrically in the US in 1965. Subsequent home video versions of Kwaidan restored this episode, and those versions run 161 minutes. This episode and the next one about Hōichi the Earless are taken from Hearn's book Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things, first published in 1904. The principal audio sources that Takamitsu uses in Yukionna, the Snow Woman, are shakuhachi and sanukite. Sanukite is a volcanic rock that produces interesting waveforms and has been made into percussion instruments. Shakuhachi is a bamboo flute that is end-blown, unlike the transverse no-con flute. Shakuhachi can produce a great range of tones and sounds, and among all of Japan's traditional musical instruments, Takamitsu was especially drawn to the shakuhachi and the biwa, a short-necked lute. Shakuhachi predominates in this episode, and the biwa predominates in the next one. The sounds that we're hearing of the wind are not natural wind noises at all, but are produced by this flute. The Yukionna is one of Japan's most famous and well-known fantastical beings. She is at once mysterious and bewitching. She appears in numerous folktales, often as a young, beautiful woman with raven black hair that contrasts with the whiteness of her kimono and face. I think this episode has the most striking and remarkable production design. The studied artificiality of the sets and effects create a memorably haunted landscape. In many ways, this is my favorite episode in the movie. I love the bleakness and the harshness that Kobayashi establishes in these snowy scenes. Among the really dazzling designs in the sequence are these eyes hovering in the sky. This is not the first time that this motif has appeared in Kobayashi's work. His third film as director, The Thick-Walled Room, features a number of dream episodes in which B and C-class Japanese war criminals housed at Sugamo prison are haunted by the cruelties they witnessed or perpetrated during the war. In one of the dream sequences, a giant open eyeball stares out from the rocky face of a ledge, observing the prisoner but unseen by him. In the context of the thick-walled room, the eye is a symbol carrying several meanings, which include the prisoner's own internal sense of guilt and torment, but also the ongoing surveillance by state authorities, militarists during the war, and the occupation forces afterward. So it's interesting that Kobayashi reprises the motif in the context of Kwaidan, where it suggests the uncanny and the haunted, but also points to his ongoing sense of political surveillance and social power as forces that loom over and against the individual. The image gives the political and social concerns that usually motivate his films a supernatural twist, while reminding us of the continuing nature of those concerns. It's also worth pointing out that Akira Kurosawa, in his film Rhapsody in August, poetically represented the atomic bombing of Nagasaki as a giant eye opening in the sky. Even though these landscapes that we're seeing are rendered as fantastically unreal locations, their wintry features had a personal meaning for Kobayashi. He was born in 1916 in Otaru, a fishing town on the coast of Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island. While the town faces the Ishikari Bay and distantly beyond that, Russia, it's otherwise ringed by mountains, and in the winter there's lots and lots of snow. It snows almost constantly and the temperatures can dip sharply. Kobayashi grew up skiing in the area, and references to Hokkaido appear in the scripts that he wrote for his mentor Kinoshita, while he apprenticed as an assistant director at Shochiku Studio from 1946 to 1952. So he knew a real-world counterpoint to the wintry scenes in this episode, although of course there's no record that he ever encountered the Yukionna while skiing. Again, it's worth repeating that we're not hearing any synchronous natural sound. It's the shakuhachi producing the wind and the wintry sounds, and so we've got a merging of music and sound effects. This shows us again the radical nature of Kobayashi and Takamitsu's experimentation with audio. Noise and music fuse as one, and this is a conjunction that Takamitsu wrote a lot about in his essays. The giant cosmic eye dissolves into the red banner as seen by Minokishi. In the story, the banner marks the ferry crossing, but that red banner is also the military flag of the Heiki clan of warriors, whose violent fate will be the subject of the next episode. Kobayashi has embedded his ongoing concern with the nation's military heritage in the supernatural elements of this episode. The symbolism remains very elegant and never gets in the way of the spooky aspects of the story. The designs tie Kobayashi's experiences as a young man opposed to the military and to the war, and a man living through the terrifically repressive culture of nationalism and militarism in the period, with the supernatural, generic aspects of these ghost stories. You're being watched in the stories by the spirits that hover just beyond the clouds at the limits of our perception, those eyes in the sky. But at the same time, everybody in Japan, communists, trade unionists, artists, intellectuals, were being watched during the war years and their activities monitored by the Toko, the special higher police, aka the peace police, aka the thought police. So we've got eyes in the sky. In the film, they are the spirits that lie beyond our senses and our perception. They correspond as well to Kobayashi's experiences during the war as a Japanese opposed to the military and under surveillance. Kobayashi's got some fabulous sets throughout the movie, and his camera positions accentuate the really fine, kind of microscopic level of detail in the production design. Today, a lot that we see in the movie would be done digitally, whereas in this film, we see the traditional approach to production design, where you've got wholly built environments, rather than the compositing of digital effects elements. Indeed, this was a very expensive film to produce, and most of the money went toward building the sets. The expense pretty much bankrupted Kobayashi's production company, and a personal loan from his old friend Kinoshita helped to keep the production afloat. Although it did well when it played at Cannes, Kobayashi never again got to work on this scale and with such lavish resources at his disposal. This camera move is conditioned by genre. It tells us that there's an unseen presence approaching the hut. Kobayashi's camera is always very fluid, and that's something he learned from Kinoshita. We cut to the interior of the cabin, and the camera travels and pans to Minokishi. And then we're going to get a cut to a reveal of the Snow Woman in this tilt up. Note that we don't often see her feet or in shots where the bottom of her kimono touches the ground. There are some iterations of Yukionna where she is footless and leaves no tracks in the snow. There's a nice theatrical lighting effect. The light comes up on her torso, and she kneels into the frame. Perhaps this light is the life energy of the older man that she is going to suck out of him while she freezes him. The compositions define her in terms of the kimono and the black hair. And this traveling shot from the face of the now dead old man around and behind the Yukionna is very characteristic of Kobayashi. Rather than cutting, often he will use the traveling camera in an arc or a diagonal to reveal detail or make a narrative point. As the light comes up again on her torso, she seems to have internalized the life force of the old man. Or maybe this is Minokishi's soul that is now radiating toward her and arousing her hunger. She seems to glide and float in these close-ups. There's a vampiric aspect of the Yukionna legends, and that's apparent here as he turns his head and exposes his neck. And in the cut to her face, the camera tilts down to reveal her open mouth. This reverse cut to Minokishi is not a simple static shot. Kobayashi's moving camera travels from him to the Yukionna, integrating them both in the frame and defining her again as a black presence, visible only in terms of her hair. The framing keeps us from seeing her in the act of speaking, adding to the ghostly effect because it seems like her voice emanates from the environment. Don't ghosts always seem to lay down conditions? In this case, he's got to keep his mouth shut or she'll get him. This is an elegantly framed shot, nicely balanced with the characters placed between the tree stump and the wood carrier, and Kobayashi holds it for a while. When she threatens him with death, the door slams shut to mark the threat, and the audio effect is placed just after the point at which it closes. And when she leaves, and the door flies open and slams shut again, there's not going to be any sound effect, apart from the shakuhachi emulating a shrill wind effect that simultaneously operates to convey the terror of the moment. We've got a real nice color shift here from the blues of the snow to the reds here of this reveal of the new landscape. What a fabulous painting. While this little narrative transition is underway, showing the boatman's discovery of the body, let's pause to note what many viewers are already quite well aware of, that it is Tatsuya Nakadai in the role of Minokishi. Nakadai was a very, very important actor for Kobayashi. He appeared in 10 films for the director, and Kobayashi really liked Nakadai's classical training. Nakadai had been trained in the Shingeki theater, as well as his cross-generational appeal. Kobayashi felt that Nakadai had a kind of very special appeal to the post-war generation of movie viewers. Nakadai was Kobayashi's persona in many films, especially The Human Condition. Just as Toshiro Mifune was Kurosawa's alter ego, Nakadai played that role for Kobayashi. Kobayashi spends a lot of time with this narrative transition as the boatman comes and discovers the body. And it's symptomatic of his comfort with a slow pace, right? There's not a lot of essential narrative information being conveyed in this section of the movie. That sonic overlay produced by the harp, bells, and the percussive effects of the Sanukite takes us to Minokishi's home, another fantastic set with everything appearing to be draped in snow. This camera move is very characteristic of Kobayashi. We go into the scene with a close-up of Minokishi, and then the camera pulls back, enlarging our view. It doesn't produce a big change in perspective, but it's very typical of Kobayashi's fluid approach to the creation of dramatic space on screen. Minokishi's mother is played by Yuko Mochizuki, who often appeared in the films of Kobayashi's mentor, Kinoshita. Most notable among these are The Ballad of Narayama in 1958 and A Japanese Tragedy in 1953. That film, Japanese Tragedy, is the first really hard-edged and angry movie that Kinoshita made. It depicts Japan during the occupation years amid the social wreckage left by the war. It's explicitly concerned with topical events and indicts the political system that emerged after the war for corruption, fraud, and continuing oppression. It cross-cuts the fictional storyline and its characters with newsreel footage of riots, crimes, protests, and crackdowns by the police. In other words, this film shows a great deal of Kobayashi's influence. He was just then finishing his apprenticeship under Kinoshita and embarking on his own career as a feature director.
今度そんな目にあったらもう取り返しがつかぬから聞いてるのかい何を言っても黙りこくって
それから1年
This is an impressive sequence.
彼は達者になると再び
Miinashi is going to chop down a tree, and it's totally convincing action.
一人で森へ出
The
かけ
narration tells us about where he is and what he's doing. And then we've got some inserts of the axe going into the wood. I point this out because it's a significant achievement in a movie where almost all of the environments are artificially constructed. This forest set is not a real location. It's an interior set, and I don't think there are any cutaways to a real place or to inserts of an actual forest. Nevertheless, that tree looks very real. Given that they're in a large military barracks with lots of space above them, maybe it's an actual tree that was planted on set. Now, when it falls, that weight looks very real, and the sound effects, unlike elsewhere in the movie, are quite naturalistic and authentic. And those sound effects carry the sense of realism that the scene conveys. The illusion of a real tree being cut down is near perfect. This scene is a good example of Kobayashi's referencing of the predominantly two-dimensional qualities in classical Japanese painting, the preoccupation with surface rather than depth. He places the characters against a flat painted backdrop, and the composition and camera perspective tends to emphasize the horizontal placement of elements in the frame instead of inviting our eye to explore items that are placed at varying distances from the camera.
どこへ
お江戸へ
We're going to get a cut to a close-up of Yuki's face, and that will be followed by a long, lingering dissolve here that overlaps her face with the incoming landscape and tells us that there's more going on with this character than Miinashi suspects. Her name, of course, also tells us that he's in deep trouble, Yuki being the word for snow. The long traveling shot that follows them along the riverbank again plays with surface rather than depth, and the traveling perspective from left to right reminds us of the medieval painted narrative scrolls that visualized a flow of narrative events in a procession meant to be scanned from left to right as the scroll was unwound. The angled cut-ins that we're going to get to one-shots of Miinashi and Yuki interfere with this effect, but as we've been seeing, Kobayashi is maintaining a balancing act, referencing traditional aesthetic modes without straying too far from many of the visual conventions of narrative cinema. And again, even though we've got various things in the foreground of many of these shots, the composition remains a planar one rather than one that emphasizes a volume of space. The linear elements in the frame, the crest of the hill, the mountaintops, and the sliver of twilight above them, call attention to the composition's two-dimensional pictorial design. The next two shots continue this emphasis. This ribbon of water and the boat floating on it, and then the close view of Miinashi that follows are consistent with Kobayashi's narrative scroll design. There's one of the all-seeing eyes. Whereas this angled cut into Yuki in the boat is not. The shakuhachi provides an eerie sonic accompaniment. Kobayashi was very familiar with Japanese and Chinese art history, having studied it at the university, and he undertook another program of study in preparation for this film. He'd also seen his mentor, Kinoshita, incorporate imakimono designs in several of his movies. The opening shots of Yatsuya Ghost Story in 1948, which Kobayashi had scripted, provide an elevated bird's-eye view and traveling perspective on a jailbreak. And Kinoshita's 1960 production, the river Fue Fuki, uses very stylized and striking color effects that take the images away from strict realism. Kobayashi characteristically cranes the camera back after opening on the close-up of the soup pot. And then he holds the composition for a while with Yuki off-screen. But she's not where we are expecting. The scene geometry that we construct based on the direction of the mother's gaze
おゆきさんという名前かね。
is confounded by Kobayashi's cut to the next shot because he crosses the line of action. The new camera setup places Yuki at screen right, while we have been plotting her position at screen left, based on where the mother had been looking. We are looking for her at one end of the frame, and she appears at the opposite end. Kobayashi's sleight of hand confounds our expectations and confuses us momentarily in the same kind of way that Takamitsu's scoring has been doing throughout the movie. The Snow Woman eludes rationality. She is not constrained by the empirical world or by the perceptible evidence that our senses furnish to us. The film points to these uncanny elements in its visual and sonic design. This is Keiko Kishi playing the Yukionna. She might be most familiar to Western viewers for her appearance in the widely seen Twilight Samurai by Yuji Yamada. Kobayashi often cast her in his movies. She appears in I Will Buy You in 1956, the film that, after A Thick-Walled Room, really inaugurated his long series of socially critical productions. She gives a terrific performance in The Inheritance, released in 1962, and then she appears as the figure of death in 1975's Kaseki, perhaps in a nod to her role in Kwaidan. We go out of the scene with a small camera move toward Yuki that complements the pull back with which the scene began. And then a long shot where Minokichi, feeling great contentment, closes the door for the night, unaware that he is cohabiting with a spirit who has a rather nasty side. 3 fast tracking shots move our perspective through these golden-hued fields in a fashion that references the left-to-right narrative format of the painted scrolls, and the flat 2D pictorial space is especially striking, with the camera moving parallel to the flat backdrop. The camera moves add energy and action to the scene, and in this regard, they're relatively rare instances of such in the film. While Kobayashi's camera is fluid and often in motion, it's a little unusual for him to use camera moves in this way to embellish action. The camera reveals her open kimono, and the nakedness on view is a little startling. Probably few viewers are anticipating or expecting this, but the detail does explain and motivate the subsequent story events, namely the children that they have together. The golden light, the warm colors, are the antithesis of the ice, snow, and cold blue light in which the Yukionna lives, as are the sensual pleasures that she and Minokichi find with one another. If the Kwaidan stories were more psychological in their tone and focus, you could imagine all of the ideas and themes that might be extracted from the present narrative situation and its design. Perhaps the Yukionna really desires to live with a mortal being of her choosing. Perhaps she's tired of the cold and snow and yearns for the warmth of family life. But delving into the personalities, thoughts, or desires of the spirit or of the mortal characters is not the object here. The point of view is more detached and observational. We will learn little about the Yukionna beyond what we already know, and the same is true for Minokichi. It is also true for the children. Perhaps the absence of psychological exploration in the stories is one of the things that drew Kobayashi to them. His dramas in the other films that he made often assume a displaced third-person perspective. While the characters are delineated in finely observed terms, it is finally their interaction with history and with oppressive forms of social power that organize his presentation and designs in the other movies that he made. In this, there is a huge difference of style and tone between Kobayashi's work and that of his mentor, Kinoshita, under whom he trained. Kinoshita's films are much warmer than Kobayashi's. They are more sentimental, they are less harsh, there is more comedy in them, they are more focused on the endearing habits of characters, and they intermix drama and humor. This may be why many of Kinoshita's films were so beloved by audiences and critics. In 1954, for example, Kinoma Jumpo, the most prestigious journal of film criticism, picked Kinoshita's 24 Eyes as the year's top film, ahead of Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Kinoshita's warm sentiment led him often to depict even bad characters with a measure of empathy, whereas Kobayashi's work tends to be cooler and his regard for evil characters can be unrelenting in its opprobrium. Now, in these scenes, we've jumped over story events and compressed time in a fashion that is unlike what we see in the other 3 episodes. The births of the children, their earliest years, the death of Minokishi's mother, Kobayashi leaps over these events, so we must surmise what he's not showing, that Minokishi has found a happy life with Yuki and that she's a good mother. These are premises that we accept for the story to continue. They are not emotional situations that are explored or dramatized. So the narrative point of view in the stories is oriented toward surface rather than depth, toward event rather than feeling, toward incidents rather than analysis, and toward leaving viewers with a feeling of the uncanny rather than with a moral lesson. In this respect, the narrative design coincides with Kobayashi's efforts to move his visual designs away from naturalism and mimesis and toward what lies beyond them. In light of what's coming, the blue outfit she's wearing is a portent. It prefigures her return to the vampiric spirit that is her true nature. The smoke from the taper curls upward. It's a traditional sign of transience and mutability. This section of the story is framed by a Buddhist appreciation for the brevity of life and its pleasures, as well as the recognition that reality, or at least what we experience as real through our senses, is an illusion, is something as substantial as dew or mist. Minokishi is about to learn all of this in a sudden and shocking way. He's feeling very happy and very contented with his domestic life, believing that it's something substantial and is going to last. Kobayashi presents the scene between the two of them by cutting back and forth and also by moving the camera, as he does here, tracking from Minokishi over to Yuki. It's a very characteristic kind of camera movement for Kobayashi. He explains that he's made some slippers for the children as well. He's feeling very connected to his wife and to his children. And the horrible thing for him is the realization that none of it is real. Nakadai plays this very well, this gentle man. Kobayashi frames this action in a high-angle view. It's a perspective that conveys the sense of a Buddha looking on at the affairs of humanity from a distance. Often in Kobayashi's movies, he depicts individuals in rebellion and protest against systems of social power, and often those characters lose their fights because the historical forces arrayed against them are just too big, too powerful. This is certainly the way that Kobayashi experienced the war and his place in a military system that he hated. While the failures of his rebel characters are noble ones, Kobayashi's sense that these failures are inevitable as the rebellions are necessary, is conveyed in the Buddha-like perspectives that his high-angle shots often carry. Minokishi tells her that red is her color as she is still young and beautiful. But is it more true that red is her color because she drains the life and blood from her victims?
これはまた特に足触りといい。
念入りに作ったもの、晴れ着に負けぬよ
う。まるで旅立ちのような。
うんいや、ろくな。
So we've got them framed comfortably as they move about the room, and he puts them now on a diagonal, extending into the depth of the frame. It's a subtle return to the way the Yukionna first appeared in the movie, framed from behind with her black hair concealing her face from the camera's attention. While the conversation seems innocuous, the camera begins a move toward Yuki and an arc around her that recenters her with the candle before this cutaway to Minokishi looking off frame. His startled look tells us what we already know and suspect. 2 shots from his point of view take us to a tight close-up of her face, accompanied by one of the most theatrical lighting changes in the movie. The warm earth tones of the house vanish as the cold blue light engulfs the room and the character. This light, produced by gelled sources off-camera, is the Yukionna, as much her figure and form as the being that Minashi has believed is his wife. These shots of Yuki are very poetic. Is the Yukionna simultaneously present as wife and as spirit? Or are the images merely subjective impressions that he has in the instant when he realizes he has seen his wife before? Kobayashi lets the ambiguity linger. The sound of the needle and thread is amplified in a way that suggests the presence of the other world, and also Minakishi's heightened senses in this moment of crisis. Takamitsu has fused music and sound effects, treating concrete sounds and natural sound sources as music.
いや、今ふと思い出しただ。10年も前のこと。不思議だな。気にも留めていなかったのに。おめえがそうやって明かりを受けて、下からオラがこうして見上げていたもんだから、急にあの夜のことを。
あの夜のこと。
そうなんだ。不思議なことがあっただよ。つい昨日のことのようだが。あの夜のことはな、今日まで誰にも言わなかっただがね、今思っても夢なのか本当のことなのか。
As Minashi relates his tale of the wintry night that Mosaku died, Kobayashi cranes and pans the camera to bring us into closer proximity with the character and to isolate him in the frame, in the kind of traveling, arcing perspective that he favors, to concentrate our attention on Minashi.
はーっと足上げているだ。するとな、凍りついて相手は自由が引かなくなってくるだ。その女がよ、オラの上にも顔を寄せてきてよ、寸前にオラはしびれかけてきただ。するとよ、そのな恐ろしい女の目が、この世にもね美しい、綺麗な。
Minashi is entranced by his narrative. And we pan the camera over to Yuki sitting silently, believing that he is breaking the vow that he made never to tell anyone about their encounter. But is he really breaking the vow? He's not telling anyone else, he's telling her. He's not revealing anything the two of them don't already know. This consideration points to the vengeful aspect of her spirit. Look at the vertical line there in the frame, formed by the wooden support for the kettle that descends from the ceiling, bisecting the frame. Kobayashi places each character on either side of that as an illustration of the gulf that is looming between them. They're sitting at opposite ends of the frame, and Yuki again is shown with her back to the camera, which sees her hair and not her face. So he holds that very designed composition for a moment. Minashi comes forward, again separated by the post that the kettle is hanging from. And Kobayashi uses a push-in to the black hair as a visual confirmation of her identity, accompanying her acknowledgement of Minakishi's words. And then a marvelous, scary shot in which she rises up, glimpsed from behind, and then seen in a close-up that frames the support beams in the ceiling so that they seem to tilt at a crazy angle. When she comes forward, Kobayashi changes the lighting palette, and the way that Yuki insists several times that it was she he met at the ferryman's dock introduces a note of vulnerability to her character. Keiko Kishi plays the character now as one feeling regret at having been discovered. And she speaks of Yuki in the third person, as if the vampiric spirit were another being and not herself. She accuses Minakishi of breaking what was to have been a binding pledge for life, and Takamitsu plays the action with lengthy passages for shakuhachi. These convey the presence of wind and storm as before, but they now also convey the personal devastation that both characters are experiencing, as well as the imminent threat that she now poses for Minakishi. When she reiterates her threat of death, Kobayashi cuts from her face to a giant eye in the sky, surrounded by smaller ones, and then he gives us a dolly in to the closed doors and a cut to a push-in on her face that creates a strong graphic match with the previous shot. And when the camera moved in, there was a small, subtle rack focus that momentarily caused her eyes to go out of focus. It's difficult to say whether the camera's point of view there was meant to be Minokishi's perspective or whether we have a more purely poetic rush of images. In either case, Kobayashi's microscopic attention to detail is very consistent with the small, expressive features of design that he's long cultivated in his movies. So Yuki appears now as she had looked at the beginning of this episode, and the home has been transformed into a snowy locale like the ferryman's hut. Minokishi and Yuki stand in our familiar high-angle framing and are separated by the hanging support for the kettle. Kobayashi has fun with theatrical lighting effects, holding a spotlight on Yuki and following her with it as she comes in toward Minokishi. The visual referencing of her hair, as in this closer shot, helps to tie this episode with the previous one. In each case, the black hair is treated as a motif referencing the vengeful spirits. She introduces the idea of betrayal, claiming that he broke the vow and it amounts to an act of disloyalty to her. If it weren't for the children, she would kill him. In other words, death is the punishment that he deserves. This turn of events derives from the Lafcadio Hearn story, but it is impossible not to feel the resonance that Kobayashi has woven into the film with the war, which in Japan is probably best described as the 15 Years' War, stretching from the seizure of Manchuria in 1931 to the attack on China in 1937, and the war in the Pacific against the U.S. and its allies. In the episode's closing imagery, Yuki is identified with the giant all-seeing eye, and the kind of loyalty that she demands is consistent with the loyalty and service that all Japanese were expected to devote to the emperor, the core figure around whom the ideological indoctrination carried out by the militarists was conducted. Just prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, for example, militarist ideologues emphasized that the emperor was directly descended from the sun goddess, and therefore that the government was a theocracy. All soldiers carried the field service code proclaiming their duty to spread the imperial way so as to make all enemies gaze up in awe and wonder at His Majesty the Emperor. The cosmic celestial eyes that Kobayashi has been referencing are a nightmarish translation of this ideal of imperial divinity and slavish service to it. But the idea of betrayal cuts in several directions. On the one hand, the film evokes the militarist era of government surveillance and imperial deification, and situates the concept of betrayal in terms of failure to honor the obligation owed to higher authorities. But at the same time, during the last terrible years of the war, as Japanese faced starvation at homes and cities leveled by Allied bombing raids, and then the lengthy privations suffered in the years following surrender, many came to feel that the militarists had betrayed them. Look at the way Yuki returns to the heavens and back into the eye, the all-seeing eye. One enduring narrative of the war holds that the militarists and the government officials betrayed the people and led it to ruin and devastation. So then, who betrayed whom? Did Minokishi betray Yuki? or has her rigid adherence to a vow she compelled him to make amounted to a betrayal of him, their home, and their children? Perhaps Kobayashi allows these resonances to linger in the film without trying to resolve them. But maybe he inclines in the last moments in the direction of her betrayal of Minokishi. Kobayashi ends the episode with a great deal of attention to Minokishi's devastation in the wake of her revelation of what she is, her threat, and most of all her departure from his home and life. The wife that he loved and believed he would spend his life with proves to have been an illusion, something that slipped from his life with the intangibility of smoke. He holds the sandals that he made for his wife and children, mementos of a life that he now is not going to have. As a sign of continuing devotion and service, he leaves her sandals in the snow in case she might return. And then, in the film's only moment where a character gives vent to deeply experienced emotions that can no longer be held in, Minokishi returns to the home and breaks down in sorrow, dropping to his knees. Kobayashi films him from the characteristic high-angle position, and he gives us a nice theatrical shift of lighting that isolates and emphasizes the character's show of grief. Yuki's betrayal of her husband has resulted in a grief that carries more emotional weight than does her cold fury. And then we go out of the episode in a final moment of poetic mystery. Perhaps she returned for them after all. Perhaps, finally, she desired a memento of her travels in the realm of mortals. The story in this episode is a very well-known folktale. It even appeared in the readers issued to schoolchildren. The naval battle of Dan-nora that forms its core is a chapter in the epic narrative, The Tale of the Hōichi, compiled in the 13th century and transmitted in oral performances by blind musicians known as biwa-hoshi. We begin with a provocation, images of crashing waves accompanied by silence, and then by the plucked strings of a biwa, a short-necked, multi-fretted lute that is one of Japan's traditional musical instruments. The film work that Takemitsu did for Kobayashi in the 1960s was very important for the composer's exploration of this instrument, and I'll say more about that shortly. The Battle of Dan-nora, accompanied by a musical performance and recitation by Kinshi Tsuruta, a prominent biwa artist with whom Takemitsu was collaborating in this period. They met when Takemitsu was working on the music score for Kobayashi's Harakiri, which was the first significant composition for biwa in post-war Japanese music. The 161-minute version of the film omits most of this very lengthy scene, and with it, Kinshi's performance. Kobayashi's stylized depiction of the battle explicitly references the medieval scrolls, many of which have depicted this famous battle. The Heike carry red banners and face their foes, warriors of the Genji clan. This battle decided the outcome of the Genpei War, a struggle between these two powerful clans for control of the government. It broke out in 1180 when the Heike leader installed his infant grandson, Entoku, on the throne as emperor. The battle had a far-reaching outcome. It marked the end of imperial rule until the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century. The victorious Genji established the first shogunate, or military government, in Kamakura, and rule by a series of shoguns continued for the next 800 years. A succession of emperors remained nominally in power, but they were mainly symbolic. Kobayashi creates a convincing illusion here. These boats in the tank are not moving. It's the camera traveling through space, past them or around them, that creates the impression of movement. We get another stylistic provocation. The narration tells us that the war drums beat loudly, and we see the action, but we don't hear the associated sound. Kobayashi dissolves the live action into and out of painted depictions of the battle, acknowledging the rich tradition of visual art that was influenced by this battle and by the destruction of the Heike. The painted representations, like the medieval battle scrolls generally, provide static, two-dimensional portraits that are oriented toward surface rather than depth, stacking elements vertically rather than representing recession in space, as in the Western tradition. Kobayashi designs his live-action reenactment of the battle accordingly. His depiction involves a series of static tableau, painted backdrops, and a marked absence of depth perspective in the images. As we watch this richly colored confrontation, it's important to note that Kwaidan is Kobayashi's first color film, and that he uses color extraordinarily well. But his embrace of color did not mark a definitive change in his work. He continued to make black and white movies after this and switched between the formats depending on his budgets and the artistic needs of a given project. The vocal performance by Kinshi Tsuruta in the reenactment of the battle is styled as if it is a recitative from the No theater. And indeed, a great many No plays incorporate elements from the tale of the Heike. One category of No plays are the warrior plays, in which the troubled ghost of a warrior who died in battle roams the land searching for peace. That is essentially the narrative situation in this episode of the film, and it's tied to the folklore that surrounds the Battle of Dan Nora, in which the troubled souls of the Heike dead are believed to haunt the sea. The folkloric tradition of the angry ghost is an extensive one, and it has influenced many stories, plays, and films. Even the modern J-horror movies like Rengu draw on this tradition. The soul or spirit after death would be peaceful or troubled depending on the circumstances under which one died. Deaths involving violence or treachery or shame could produce a troubled spirit, an angry ghost that lingered in the area seeking vengeance or causing mischief, and it was important to placate these troubled souls. The Biwa Hoshi, who gave musical performances of the tale of the Heike, evolved from the traveling entertainers who could be found in the 10th century. In the 12th century, this group of performers had assimilated the Heike narrative into their repertory. These entertainers also conducted rituals to placate the dead, to prevent plague and disease, or to ward off evil spirits. The biwa was considered to be an instrument that could communicate with the other world, and thus, as the Heike narrative was picked up by the biwa hoshi, a common function that the recitations assumed was exorcism. By performing the Heike music and narrative, the restive spirits of the dead warriors could be calmed. This is the drama that we have in the film, and the setting, a Buddhist temple, has a historical basis. Some who performed the Heike narrative were blind Buddhist monks, and the rituals of appeasement were sometimes performed in Buddhist temples. Our character, Hōichi, is an attendant at the temple and does not realize that he is dealing with ghosts. Kobayashi gives us a lengthy dramatization of the final stages of the battle, in which we see a number of key events and characters, and all of it is accompanied by the biwa recitative performed by Tsuruta. Some of the elements in her musical performance create interesting sound effects that appealed to Takemitsu, who valued the conjunction of music and noise and the sound of natural objects treated as a form of music. The truncated version of the sequence that appears in shorter cuts of the film is especially unfortunate because we lose much of her performance. A musician plays the biwa by plucking the strings with a pick or plectrum. Tsuruta creates interesting sound effects by scraping the plectrum against the strings to make a rasping noise. She also knocks the plectrum against the body of the biwa after plucking a string, or even while doing so. You can hear quite a bit of this during the final section of the battle sequence. For his part, Takemitsu added reverberation to the recording of the biwa and also the vocal performance, so that both assumed greater bulk and depth of tone. And he has added slowed down no singing as an almost subliminal background element, which adds a considerable sound floor anchoring the musical performance and the visual action. The Tale of the Heike is a military story, a battle epic, and the biwa was often heard on the radio during the war years of the 1930s and 1940s. It became an instrument closely associated with the militarism of those years, and for this reason, avant-garde musicians of Takemitsu's generation often wanted to have little to do with it. In his personal tastes and his composing, Takemitsu was very invested in avant-garde Western traditions. And it was not until a 6-year period lasting from 1961 to 1967 that he had a sustained involvement with composition for biwa and shakuhachi. His scores for Kobayashi in Harakiri and Kwaidan are his first extended compositions for these instruments. And he returned to the biwa again for Kobayashi in Samurai Rebellion in 1967. Kobayashi had his own intensive personal awareness of militarism, and in collaboration with Takemitsu, they used the biwa as a musical source pointing to and commenting upon the military tradition as it was manifest in Japanese history. Kobayashi and Takemitsu shared a sensitivity to the destructive effects of Japan's militarist adventure, so their collaboration was a congenial one and a natural outgrowth of their personal philosophies and temperament. Thus, Kobayashi's films furnished Takemitsu with a key venue for exploring this instrument, and the work on these movies led to 2 concert compositions for Tsuruta on biwa. The best known of these, November Steps in 1967, brought Takemitsu his first great international acclaim. It showcased Tsuruta on the biwa and Katsuya Yokoyama on shakuhachi and placed these soloists in counterpoint to concert hall music performed by the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. Of course, there's the boy emperor and his grandmother. Much of the naval battle involved exchanges of arrows shot by archers on each side, and we see this in other details of battle deaths that Kobayashi shows without glorification. He's interested in the opportunities for stylization that this reenactment gives him, but not in the martial or militarist values that are enshrined in the Tale of the Heike. His point of view is a more distant one, a more detached one, than a celebratory one. We get a long, slow camera move, revealing details of the impending decision that the grandmother has made. This is the emotional high point of this section of the Tale of the Heike. In the legend that forms the basis for the tale, the surviving clan members commit suicide by leaping from their boats rather than face defeat or surrender to their enemy. And Toku's grandmother murders him by leaping into the sea, carrying the boy with her, promising him that before they go, she will take him to paradise in the next world. Kobayashi shows this dispassionately, with the remaining Heike playing out their string in a resigned, almost passive fashion. Their faces look robotic and emotionless as they contemplate their impending destruction. Their collective suicide is framed in the saga as an honorable action. But Kobayashi, of course, well knew its 20th century legacy. During the war, suicide in battle was venerated as one of the highest forms of imperial service and loyalty. The commandment for all Japanese soldiers to fight to the death gained widespread social acceptance in the 1930s and was formalized as a military practice in 1941. Movies, newspapers, and songs celebrated the so-called human bomb heroes, soldiers who blew themselves up in order to save comrades or kill enemies. And in the military propaganda of the era, children's lives belonged to the emperor, not to their parents. And mothers should rejoice when their sons died for the imperial way in battle. In his previous film, Harakiri, Kobayashi had exposed the practice of warrior suicide as a hollow and fraudulent ritual, and he has not changed his mind here. The robotic behavior of the Heike in their final moments is proof for Kobayashi of the inhumanity of military rituals that glorify death. As the Heike clan flags burn and collapse, we return to the coast and the narrator tells us about the Heike crabs. This is an actual species that is native to Japan, and their shells have the markings that we will see, markings that seem to resemble human faces. Thus they've become known as the samurai crabs or the ghost crabs, and are thought to be incarnations of the spirits of the dead warriors, a manifestation of their restive and unsatisfied souls. We shift to the main narrative of the episode by evoking the ritual function served by Buddhist temples, that of pacifying the restive spirits of the dead. Takamitsu places the sound of the second bell toll slightly behind where it should be, keeping us just a little bit off balance. This is Katsuyo Nakamura in the role of Hōichi. This is the only film of Kobayashi's in which he appears. You can find him in movies by Nagisa Oshima, Hiroshi Inagaki, and in a couple of the Godzilla movies, but in general he was not a big player in the films of Kobayashi's era. Kobayashi's movies have a very deliberate pace, and these two shots of the watermelon are a good illustration of that. Here's our old friend Takashi Shimura playing the elder priest. He's best known, of course, for the many films he made with Akira Kurosawa, and this is his only appearance in a film by Kobayashi. We don't see him in close-up for a little while yet, but when we do, notice that he looks with his shaven head quite robust, much like he did 10 years previously in Seven Samurai, where he played the leader of the seven. You can see in this shot why Kobayashi gave those watermelons so much attention. Their red color links nicely to this exterior, especially the dramatic wash of red and amber up there in the sky. This is another of the film's wonderful sets. Look at how expansive it is, and the exquisite lighting in this shot convincingly portrays the onset of twilight. The shadows that fall across the bridge and pond suggest the sun setting behind the stone staircase that fronts the temple and the trees that encircle it. So Kobayashi just holds this composition for a moment, kind of gently going out of this sequence. And we go into a moving camera shot, the first of a series, as the camera pulls back from Hōichi, who sits there eating his watermelon. We tilt up to reveal the exterior grounds that surround the temple, through which a ghostly presence is going to move. And that presence is signaled by the onset of this traveling point of view shot. It tells us that there's an unseen presence here in the grounds. Takamitsu is supplying a very strange audio effect, one that is a little bit disorienting because it's hard to identify. Hōichi comes out now. Kobayashi films him in this expansive composition where he's surrounded by all of this space that is not quite empty. And he senses that something is there. As he pauses, we cut to this great shot as the camera draws near to Hōichi, who turns to listen to something at his back, but no, it's on the temple veranda, or inside. We're in horror film territory here. That creaking door is the kind of source-connected sound effect that we don't get much of in the film. And the moving camera shots that we've seen are the sort that have been widely appropriated by horror movie directors because they're so effective. Takamitsu gives us these electronic audio effects to mark the unseen presence, putting them at intervals that are hard to anticipate. And so again, we're kept a little bit off balance in our abilities to link image and sound. Now, when Hōichi drops his fan, the audio effect is very pronounced. And it's a little bit poetic, too, because the fan isn't going to make that loud a sound dropping onto a dirt floor. Here's another of Kobayashi's well-known high-angle shots, evoking the parallel perspective often seen in the imakimono. When Hōichi begins to play the biwa, note that the sounds do not have the reverberation that we heard in the earlier performance of the Heiki-yoku, or Song of the Heiki. But his playing seems to conjure the spirit of the Heiki samurai. The biwa is capable of communicating with the other world. You can see the plectrum there, the way the strings are plucked, and the eccentric elements of Kinshi Tsuruta's performance involve making expressive use of that plectrum, banging it on the lute or scraping it on the strings. Our character of Hōichi doesn't do that. We don't see him doing that. So the moving camera now establishes the approach of the samurai ghost. And a matted dissolve brings the spirit into the physical world. Right there. Often in no plays, the ghost of a warrior appears first as a seemingly physical human being, and only subsequently is revealed to be a ghost. Something like that happens here, with Hōichi mistaking the group of heike for whom he plays as actual people. It's not just his blindness at work in this, but also a story convention.
私は目倉でこのお寺様にお世話をいただいてまだ日も浅く、どうも先ほどからどなたがお庭においでのように思いましたが、失礼をいたしました。お許しくださいまし。
A tilt up reveals that the warrior is played by actor Tetsuro Tamba, a prolific and widely cast actor in movies from the 1960s into the 2000s. He worked with many of the great post-war directors. He appeared in Shinoda's Assassination, Hideo Gosha's Goyokin, Yuzo Itami's A Taxing Woman Returns, Yoji Yamada's Twilight Samurai, and he played James Bond's buddy, Tiger Tanaka, in You Only Live Twice. Coming up is a pair of shots that is very characteristic of Kobayashi. The camera travels on a diagonal from a framing of the two characters into a close shot of Hōichi. And then we have the reciprocal as the camera travels on a diagonal into a close view of the samurai. Kobayashi has done a lot of this in his previous film, Harakiri, and the camera's movements in these kinds of shots are analytical ones, tracing the visible lines of power in society as they are manifest between hierarchical relations of superior and subordinate. The camera moves visualize the impermeable lines of force in feudal society, which in Kobayashi's period films are understood as manifestations of social oppression and cruelty. They are what his rebel characters rise up against and try to combat. And while Hōichi is not one of these rebels, he too is caught in the web of power that gives the Heike warriors, even as ghosts, a set of prerogatives that entitle them to demand his services. Their promise not to harm him is not a binding one because they enjoy certain rights of violence that do not extend to non-samurai. Hōichi's dilemma is not just that he is blind and unable to see them for the spirits they are, but that he is essentially their vassal, and they can do with him what they want. It's a splendid color effect there. We're going into a really neat sequence in the film. It's a kind of a purely visual sequence where we reveal a new aspect of the set by bringing up the lights there, and the camera moves through the gate. Of course, we're entering into the spirit world now. Hōichi doesn't know that. We dissolve to a shot of the steps as they travel up. And Kobayashi gives us a vertical camera move as the camera ascends upward. He was interested to explore the spiritual domain in this movie, and verticality certainly gives us an index of transcendence and the spiritual domain. The battered Heike flags, the primary colors against the blue sky. You know, he's just showing off his filmmaking virtuosity. the extraordinary sets, the extraordinary color design that his cinematographer and production designer have given him. It's a splendid sequence, and it's among the most purely pleasurable ones in the film. It's just a series of ravishing images, one after another. And seeing this film in 2K on Blu-ray is a great way to showcase his achievements. This composition is highly symmetrical, and that serves to reduce our sense of spatial depth and play up the surface features of its more two-dimensional design, in spite of the fact that we have a central vanishing point here. Kobayashi is going to play with the vanishing point in the next few moments. Hōichi is led into the next area beyond the pillars there. And as he's drawn deeper into the spirit world, we cut here to this shot, which also has a central vanishing point. And it gives us an expanse of blue sky. The blues in the sky that we see here and have seen in earlier shots evoke the watery grave of the Heike clan and the naval battle that preceded it. Very ominous feeling as she leads him away. To make the point clearer, the scene changes to Dan Nura on the inland sea and a color design at twilight that is very monochromatic, with blues predominating. This is one of the few actual location shots in the movie, and Kobayashi uses it to striking effect, opening up the film from its more theatrical enclosures. We've got a lengthy interval here before we see Hōichi performing for the Heike clan, and during which the other people at the temple try to figure out why he's behaving so strangely. So this is a good time to say a bit about Kobayashi, his career, and the experiences that led him to make the kind of films that he did. His treatment of the tale of the Heike and the Battle of Dan Nura is not a celebration of military valor and honor. He couldn't make that kind of film. More than most of Japan's major filmmakers in the post-war era, Kobayashi's work focused on the brutality of Japan's army and of military systems in general. The war was a great trauma deeply influencing his work and also his life. When he graduated from the university in 1941, he joined Shochiku Studio as a filmmaker in training, but he was drafted almost immediately, putting his career on the skids. For a sensitive young man, the war was like a great poisonous cloud blighting the future. Director Kihachi Okamoto, for example, was a young man of draft age living in Tokyo and was infatuated with cinema. He thought he had no future because of the war. He said, "I was thinking any day I would get drafted and then die. I thought I'd probably end my life by about 21. Kobayashi, too, reflected after the war that he managed to live through it only because of an accident of fate. In 1944, his regiment left Manchuria and was heading for the Philippines, which Japan then occupied. American forces were massing for an air and ground assault, but Allied submarines, which had devastated Japan's merchant fleet, prevented Kobayashi's group from reaching the island. They headed for Okinawa instead, where the same thing was happening. The Japanese army was prepping for a fierce battle in a desperate attempt to head off what everyone knew was coming, an invasion of the homeland. But again, Kobayashi's group couldn't get through, and so they diverted to the island of Miyakojima, 186 miles southwest of Okinawa. Because of his location, he avoided the huge battles that occurred in 1944 and 1945 on the Philippines, Okinawa, and in the Gulf of Leyte. Japanese casualties there are estimated at close to 500,000. The two-month battle on Okinawa produced 65,000 American casualties and more than 100,000 among the imperial forces, with an additional 100,000 civilians killed, many in acts of suicide that were coerced by the Japanese army. The scale of slaughter was impressive. Kobayashi said, "Had I landed in either Okinawa or the Philippines, Or even on Lady Island, I doubt whether I would have survived. By chance, I ended up on the island of Miyakojima, and that is why I am alive today. Kobayashi had been drafted into the Kwantung Army. This was Japan's field unit inside Manchuria, which was the northeastern area of China that Japan had seized in 1931. The army engineered a pretext for invading Manchuria by blowing up a section of the South Manchuria Railway and blaming it on Chinese warlords. This faked provocation became the so-called Manchurian Incident of 1931. Manchuria was resource-rich, and Japan was in the throes of worldwide depression. Intent on becoming a first-rate world power, Japan emulated the imperialist model and practices of the Western nations, England, France, the Netherlands, which had annexed and colonized territory in Southeast Asia. So in 1937, Japan expanded the war by invading northern China, which was rich in coal, iron, and cotton. The Shanghai Incident, an exchange of fire between Japanese and Chinese troops on the Marco Polo Bridge, provided the pretext. To secure additional sources of oil, Japan occupied northern Indochina in 1940 and southern Indochina in 1941. These moves prompted the U.S. to embargo oil and scrap metal exports to Japan, and with England and Holland to freeze Japanese assets. Economically encircled now, and to secure its access to oil in South Asia, Japan attacked the U.S. Southern Fleet at Pearl Harbor. This was the situation when Kobayashi found himself thrust into the war. Kobayashi did not see frontline fighting during his years in Manchuria. He was situated near Harbin, which was a major railway hub and operations base for the top-secret but now notorious Unit 731, which was disguised under the euphemistic name Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Unit. Thousands of Chinese and Russian prisoners transported to Harbin from Manchuria and China were subjected to grisly medical experiments that included vivisection and being used as human guinea pigs to test the effects of germ warfare and the wounds that hand grenades and flamethrowers could inflict. Even American POWs were there, shot down in the Doolittle raid, and at least one was vivisected. After the war, American occupation forces did not prosecute these crimes, but instead shielded the doctors and scientists that worked there in exchange for their cooperation in aiding U.S. efforts to develop biological weapons. The work at Unit 731 is one of the era's severest and most grotesque war crimes, and Kobayashi's geographic proximity to the camp likely led him in later years to reflect deeply upon the nature of the war, which he called the culmination of human evil. So too did the heritage of the military unit to which he was assigned. The 3rd Azabu Regiment had helped to engineer the so-called February 26th incident in 1936. An attempted coup by a faction within the Imperial Army that wanted to establish a military government. The Azabu soldiers assassinated the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal and the Inspector General of Military Education. Other mutineers occupied the Diet, the War Ministry, the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, and the homes of the Prime Minister and War Minister. They assassinated the Finance Minister, who'd been opposed to expanding military spending, and killed other high-ranking government and military officials. This incident capped a long interval during which the Imperial Army murdered prominent political leaders. When Kobayashi was drafted, he already held a strong dislike for the military, and it was compounded by his awareness of the recklessness and hostility to civilian rule of the regiment in which he served. Although Kobayashi had avoided the fighting on Okinawa, after Japan surrendered, he was interned for a brief period in an Allied POW labor camp there. The Allies delayed the repatriation of thousands of Japanese soldiers so they could be used to help dismantle the military installations on Okinawa, the Philippines, and elsewhere in the Pacific. But even had he not been detained as a POW, repatriation was a slow process because of the huge numbers of Japanese, more than 6 million, who were deployed throughout China and the Pacific. Transporting these personnel and dissolving the army continued into 1947. The Japanese had treated their POWs quite harshly, in part because they regarded surrender as a disgraceful and shameful act. Aware of this brutality, the Allies made a point of treating prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions. This was not the kind of inhuman death camp that he depicted being run by the Japanese and Soviet armies in his film The Human Condition. Indeed, while interned, he ran a theater company among the inmates and wrote and produced several shows. Kobayashi returned to Japan in 1946 and rejoined Shochiku as an apprentice. The war had crippled and stunted the once robust creativity of the Japanese cinema. Kobayashi missed the worst years of the war at home and the infliction of the most draconian of the government censorship policies, but it had set back his career considerably. He faced a 6-year apprenticeship before he could graduate to director, and he served it under Keisuke Kinoshita, who was only 4 years older than Kobayashi. Kinoshita had not gone to university like Kobayashi did, but went straight into a film career, joining Shochiku in 1933. He served a short interval in the military, but was wounded and discharged. The years that Kobayashi had spent at the university and then in the war gave him a very late start on his career. Still, Kobayashi was fortunate in securing work when he did. Many veterans didn't fare so well and found themselves homeless, unemployed, or faced with starvation. Moreover, the public who had sent them off with cheers and celebration had turned against the militarists, whose policies had produced so much devastation and dishonor. Under these circumstances, returning like his peers to a ruined country whose economic and industrial infrastructure had been destroyed, Kobayashi was very fortunate in being able to resume the career that the war had interrupted. But he had to spend those 6 years as an apprentice, and then it was another 4 years before he was able to make the kind of films he wanted to make. He graduated to director in 1952, and the next year, for his third film, he made The Thick-Walled Room, about the B and C class Japanese war criminals held at Sugamo Prison. Shochiku was appalled at the movie because it depicts brutalities and killings inflicted by Japanese soldiers as well as by the Allied forces. The studio suppressed the film until 1956, but at that time, years after the censorship of the occupation period had ended, Kobayashi had found the freedom to embark on a remarkable series of tough, socially critical movies. Black River depicts the crimes surrounding the U.S. military bases in Japan. I Will Buy You shows the greed and ruthlessness that a free market economy had unleashed. And he then made his magnum opus, The Human Condition, a 10-hour epic about a pacifist played by Tatsuya Nakadai and his horrific experiences during the war in China. Kaji, the character played by Nakadai, is Kobayashi's persona. I am Kaji, Kobayashi has said, and the film distills his experiences in Manchuria with military brutality and oppression, and expresses his pacifist outlook. Kinema Jumpo placed The Human Condition on its list of the great Japanese films of all time. Kobayashi then made a series of 3 period films, of which Kwaidan is the middle work. The others are Harakiri and Samurai Rebellion. And these two are ruthless exposés of samurai brutality and the emptiness of the feudal codes of honor. The impact of Harakiri was especially strong. Nobody had seen or dared to make such a thorough deconstruction of the codes of Bushido, nor expose them as this film did as instruments of political oppression. Kobayashi's mentor, Kinoshita, with whom he had stayed in touch, called Harakiri one of Japan's greatest films. As the 60s drew to a close, however, so too did the golden age of Japanese cinema. Faced with competition from television, the industry was contracting, and the financial reins were tightened on filmmakers. Kobayashi never again worked with the resources he had on Kwaidan. He joined with his mentor Kinoshita and fellow directors Kurosawa and Kan Ishikawa in forming their own production company in an effort to get their films to market. But the failure of Kurosawa's Dodesukiden, the company's first picture, brought the venture to an end. Kobayashi's career had thrived for slightly more than a decade when he had the freedom and resources to make the sort of films he wanted to make, movies that might make a difference in the world. But the era of Japan's socially critical cinema was ending. Kobayashi persisted and remained haunted by the war and its crimes. He examined these again in his 1968 film Youth of Japan, and then in the huge documentary Tokyo Saiban about the Allied tribunal in Tokyo that prosecuted the A-list war criminals. This was his last epic work. In these films and in his overall career, Kobayashi became the conscience of the nation, examining its militarist heritage even past the point where there were fewer and fewer rewards for doing so.
Hoichi君がHōichiがどうかしたの？やっぱり出かけました。たった今。何をグズグズしとるんじゃ。はよ後をつけていかんか。松蔵にもそう言うて手取られるでないぞ。はよ行け。はい。これを持って。はよ。松蔵殿は。おい。はよせんかい。なかなか火が。なんじゃ目焼きや不自由だの。はよせんか。お前先に。今日って。当たり前じゃ。真夜中が明るいわけないわ。ゴロゴロ様が。雷がなんじゃ。はよ行け。松蔵。何をしとる。はよ探さんか。どっちゃいたんやろの。あっちか。まだそう遠くへ行けるわけがない。お前らあっち行け。走って行け。
As Hōichi is led to the hall where the Heike clan is assembled, we pass through some of the sets that we've seen earlier. Takamitsu's electronically processed no chanting is slowed down so that it seems like a rumble coming from some sinister netherworld. It's an especially dominant sound cue in the scene. This set here is very dramatically positioned against the sky. It gives the feeling like we're on the cosmic edge of things, where one world slides over into another. There could be some shakuhachi tones mixed into this assembly of sound, but it's a little hard to tell. And that's exactly Takamitsu's objective. He wants to defamiliarize the sound so their point of origin becomes mysterious and murky. And by doing that, they become a bridge between this world and another. Indeed, Kobayashi said this was one of his goals with the film, to show a spiritual domain that lies beyond the empirical world. The camera travels with the characters laterally across the frame, parallel to the back wall of the set, and the screen surface, rather than traveling through space into the depths of the set. And this accentuates our sense of the flatness of the image and the represented world on screen. The actor playing Yasuko is Kuniya Tanaka. He's got a strange and interesting face, and Kurosawa used him especially well in Sanjuro, where he plays a none-too-bright samurai whose buffoonish doings irritate our hero, Toshiro Mifune. Coming up is a startling and impressively pictorial edit, a cut, to the Heike clan, here assembled for Hōichi's musical recitation. And we see again Kobayashi's use of reciprocal moving camera shots that visualize the lines of power. Moving out from Emperor Antoku and moving in from a high angle on Hōichi kneeling in obeisance. The symmetricality of this formal grouping describes the architecture of political power, with Hōichi and Antoku center frame, the former below the latter. Kobayashi holds this shot for a very long time because of what it shows us. Hōichi's encirclement by the warrior clan is a visual statement about domination, and the extreme formality of the composition works here as similar ones did in Harakiri to convey the calcified institutional nature of this structure of dominance and submission. The red slash crossing the sky in the back there reminds us of the Heike battle flags and also of the bloodshed that drenches this world of military control. Although the Heike fought to preserve the entitlements of their emperor, the clash between these powerful clans, Heike and Genji, emblemized the historic shifts underway as political authority moved from the emperor to a succession of military governments. With his experiences in Japan's imperial army and its war in China, with his pacifist values and his sympathy for individuals trapped by inhuman systems of power, Kobayashi could not film a conventional approach to the tale of the Heike, one that celebrated their nobility and mourned their passing. The story of Hōichi probably appealed to him because he could offer the Heike as vengeful ghosts, behaving ruthlessly, and who mutilate a blind Buddhist acolyte. The terms of this kind of portrait resonated for Kobayashi with his understanding of how military systems operate and with the dangers that their authoritarian nature poses when it assumes control of the levers of power in society. Here's a variation on the long master shot that we've just been seeing. The emperor is at the center and highest point of the frame, surrounded by his military guardians, and Hōichi sits at the lower part of the frame, with the architecture of the set and the water separating him from those whom he serves. When he begins to play, Kobayashi produces another pair of reciprocal moving camera shots. The camera pulls away from Hōichi, enlarging our perspective and revealing more details of his encirclement by power. And in a reverse angle cut, moving in the opposite direction, the camera traces a path from Hōichi to the emperor. The camera's speed and angle of movement match in both shots, but Kobayashi introduces a variation in the second of these shots that differentiates it. You have to look closely to see it, but at this point now, as the camera passes over the emperor, it begins to descend, so that the emperor is elevated in the frame and assumes greater visual weight. In the previous shot of Hōichi, the camera did not do this as it pulled away from him. Kobayashi's ability to fashion intricate patterns of design woven with very subtle details is quite impressive, and it is not something that typifies most filmmakers. Hōichi's humane gesture toward the clan, offering to perform that part of the story that they most value, the naval battle of Dan-nura, is coldly accepted by them as the prerogative that is their due. In their world, all human behaviors are coded by the hierarchy of power, and Hōichi's gesture is not seen as a humane act, but merely as a service that he is bound to deliver. And then we return to our pair of bumpkins, jittery and nervous in the spooky, foggy grounds of the old desolate graveyard. The flying demon fires appear, emissaries of the vengeful ghosts and associated with the fishermen victims on whom they've been preying. The flying fire is one of the film's rare visual effects, and it's interesting to consider that Kobayashi has cast the film's ghostly spell without relying excessively on visual effects that could become vulgar. He's achieved the film's atmosphere mainly using set and lighting design, and the presence of the uncanny is evoked by Takemitsu's score and by an occasional visual effect. Most of these, however, involve changes of color design or makeup that are applied between shots or by using archaic techniques like double exposing the image. You can easily imagine how vulgar the movie might be today if it were made. It very well could become a showcase for digital visual effects. The stylized artifice of Kobayashi's enactment of the naval battle, where we see only a couple of boats and a few actors in a water tank, that is obviously not the inland sea, might become a Peter Jackson-style extravaganza. A digital horde of thousands of warriors might do battle on a convincing animated sea. Kobayashi is faithful to the traditional aesthetics that he seeks to honor. It's not realistic portraiture that he's after, but what can be suggested indirectly through silence, emptiness, the surfaces of the design, and a deliberate reduction in the number of elements that are employed. Everything is designed to gesture toward what is not seen but felt, to move us away from the literal and toward the figurative, from what is known and observed to what is intuited, from the empirical to the poetic. I think this painting is one that was commissioned for the film, designed expressly to be used in these sequences. Kobayashi has changed the set behind the Heike warriors to suggest that the power of Hōichi's music has transported them back in time, and they're now literally inhabiting the moment of their destruction in the naval battle. As the camera pans, you can see figures and objects warping as they pass across the width of the frame, particularly at the side edges. This is called field curvature, and it's an artifact produced by the optics of the anamorphic lenses that Kobayashi is using. Movies like Kwaidan that are shot anamorphically have numerous artifacts of the photographic process, and it helps give these films their very distinctive look. There aren't a lot of movies today shot anamorphically. The process flourished in the 50s and 60s, and these artifacts are part of what makes it fun to watch widescreen movies from this era. This very long panning shot shows us the encirclement of Hōichi by the clan. It takes us around the perimeter of the military power that encloses him. As Kobayashi gives us a montage of warrior faces and images from the painting, you can hear numerous examples of Tsuruta's unconventional playing style, her use of the plectrum to create noise effects that are assimilated into the musical performance. The synthesis of noise and music is very consistent with what Takamitsu has been doing all through the movie. He's not repeating the battle enactment that we've seen earlier. He's conveying it now with the painting. Great theatrical effects as spotlights bring the warrior faces up from the shadows, and the effects of battle become visible in the assembled clan. As the Heike contemplate their deaths, as described in the song, their expressionless faces are not merely stoic, but are, in fact, devoid of human feeling. For Kobayashi, this describes the essential nature of power and domination in a closed militarist society. They look expressionlessly into the void, contemplating the cruelty of the fate that has befallen them. The cloud design in the translight there behind them has some resemblance to the giant eyes that we had seen in the earlier episode dealing with Yukionna. This is the Buddhist element in the tale, the insistence on the transience of life, the shortness of accomplishment and glory. Camera does a very slow pull back now, allowing Kobayashi to display the breadth and expansiveness of his set. This is a built world. This is not a film from location. And the effects are often very theatrical. When Masako and Yasuko call Hōichi, we get this splendid scene transition using the theatrical lighting change to represent the fading away of the Heike spirits as they once more relinquish their hold on the world. And the camera pans up the assembled clan, appearing now as they did before Hōichi's performance. And then 3 splendid dissolves create graphic matches in a shot series that connects the groupings of 3 characters to the grave markers where their spirits dwell. The dissolves take us from illumination to darkness, from spirit to stone, from the next world back to this one. When we return to Hōichi, we see the landscape for the first time as it truly has been, not an ornate Heike palace, but a desolate fog-draped graveyard. The camera pulls back in a gradual reveal of the location and its barrenness. Hōichi knows not where he is. He's been possessed not just by the spirits, but by his music and by the bridge it has established between this world and the other. The flying fire and the rolling mist beckon from that other world, and Hōichi is in danger of becoming a lost soul, stranded between both worlds. As he struggles with Masako and Yasuko, his face is lit and made up like the samurai's face had been in the climax of the Black Hair episode, suggesting that he is in the grip of a similar madness induced by vengeful ghosts. As they drag him off, a reverse angle cut shows us the graveyard, and the bursts of light in the sky are a transfiguration of Kobayashi's cosmic eye motif, reminding us of the Shinto deity, the sun goddess, the shining light of heaven, and of her political transformation and appropriation by militarist ideologues during the war. The Heike remain watching us and our world, reappearing from the grave markers and caught within their moment of historical trauma from which they cannot escape and which they are condemned to repeat throughout eternity. Tattered battle flags drop into the sea. And we're left with the mist and the grave markers, and the suggestion of lightning achieved through theatrical lighting. In this shot of Hōichi, and the next one showing the priest, we can see Kobayashi's fondness for framing his scene so that the lines of architecture run at oblique angles across the frame. In many of his shots, like these, instead of giving us compositions that accentuate right angles and perpendicular lines, the architecture slopes on a diagonal. In Kwaidan, this compositional preference enables Kobayashi to approximate the oblique projections found in the medieval scroll paintings, although his preference for these skewed compositions runs deeper than the experimentation carried out in this film. You can see him use similar compositions throughout quite a few of the pictures that he made. His designs are very different in this respect from, say, those of Yasujiro Ozu, whose interior shots emphasize perpendiculars and right angles. Kobayashi cuts into the space of the group shot here during this interrogation of Hōichi, cutting between the characters. And now in this shot, as the priest warns Hōichi about the danger that he faces, the camera begins to do a slow arc around Hōichi. Here we go. This kind of traveling shot is a design element that Kobayashi frequently uses. I believe he learned it first from Kinoshita, his filmmaking mentor, during that 6-year apprenticeship, but then he uses it a lot in his own movies. The ringing of the bell gives us a naturalistic sound effect, and cutting away to this long shot of the temple facilitates Takamitsu's ability to place small intervals of silence at the moment that we're expecting to hear the bell. He's going to do it again after this cutaway to the interior. Note that the soup bowl is dead center on screen, and the red light of twilight in this shot and the next one in the bell chamber anticipate the dramatic revelation of the first character of the Holy Sutras in red being painted on Hōichi's body. Series of very nice color matches unify that shot series. You can see here again Kobayashi's fondness for setting his camera to emphasize oblique angles. The widescreen format accentuates his ability to do this because of the way it calls out these features of linear design. The oblique lines flow across the entire widescreen, which makes the design more insistent and exaggerated. In the Lafcadio Hearn version of the story, this scene is described only briefly, and it is not presented with much dramatic impact. Hearn simply tells us that the priest and his acolyte cover Hōichi's body with the Holy Sutras. But Kobayashi gives us a magnificent scene, visualized in such a memorable way that it becomes one of the key moments in the movie that people remember. So iconic, in fact, is this scene, especially this close-up of Hōichi's face as his eyelids are covered with characters, that the advertising images for the movie drew heavily upon it. Takamitsu's sound design uses reverberation and a layering of electronically distorted sounds with the Buddhist chanting to accentuate the somber tone and spooky nature of the action. I think we also see in the scene Kobayashi's love for the ancient arts influenced by Buddhism and that could be found in the temples of Nara, that his mentor, Izu Yaichi, had become famous for studying. Kobayashi especially loved Buddhist statuary, and he gets to put some of it on display in this scene. A nice theatrical lighting effect there. Now that the priest and Dankai are finished, Hōichi awaits their instruction, and the priest gives him and us the ground rules about what is going to happen and how it must occur. The sutras will render him invisible to the Heike spirits, and he's got to sit quietly lest their emissary becomes aware of his presence. As all of this is laid out in detail, and the priest asks Dankai if he's covered all of Hōichi's body with the sutras, we can see quite clearly that he hasn't. Hōichi's poor ears pop out at us because they remain naked, uncovered by the sutras. So how come the priest or Dankai don't see what we do? Because the scene is visualized in such detail, this narrative question stands out in a way that it does not from the prose of Hearn's story. It's a narrative problem for which there really is no good answer, and the viewers got to accept it so that the story can move forward. It's kind of like, how come the Indians don't shoot the horses in Stagecoach? If they did, it would stop the story. So, although it's not plausible they wouldn't have seen the uncovered ears, we have to just nod and accept it so that we can move forward. The other element that is curious about this segment in the story is that the priest and Dankai leave Hōichi and the temple because they have a task to perform. Their absence enables the next set of events to occur, but one might be forgiven for thinking that the rampaging spirits of an angry bunch of ghosts threatening to tear poor Hōichi apart might be reason enough for sticking around. But let's not quibble over such details. The story is a kind of fable, and strange things often happen in fables. So now we get the critical question. Have you written the text? Yes, on the whole body from head to toe. Now, the camera angle in this shot doesn't let the ears stand out too much. The crane down to Hōichi and his biwa establishes the fluid traveling perspectives that Kobayashi is going to use in the next few shots to set our anticipation for the appearance of the samurai ghost. These eerie noises supplied by Takamitsu accompany the static shot of the courtyard, and then Kobayashi uses this elegant traveling shot to show us the comical reactions of Masaki and Yasuko as they tremble in fear at the coming visit. Kobayashi's movies don't typically have a lot of humor in them, and this is a rare moment. Yes, it's best to hide from vengeful ghosts. The camera pulls away from Hōichi and travels through the empty grounds until we get a double exposure that shows the approach of the ghost. Kobayashi uses this somewhat archaic visual effect, the double exposure, that avoids vulgar display and that looks with a backward nod to the early cinema genre of the trick film that used dissolves and in-camera mats to display magical events and the ghostly comings and doings of spirits. I think we can also see in these moving camera shots one of the iconic features of contemporary horror movies, the traveling optical point of view that establishes the off-screen presence of a sinister force or character. It was Bob Clark's Black Christmas in 1974 and John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978 that brought this technique into the modern horror genre. I don't know if they saw Kobayashi's film, but in any case, we can see how this technique is inherently suited for conveying a sense of dread and anxiety. In this shot, we get a splendid optical transition that is one of the film's most sophisticated visual effects. The ghost assumes solid form, and Hōichi loses solidity except for his ears. It introduces a perspective shift that enables us to see Hōichi as he appears to the spirit. It is as if we have slipped out of our domain of reality and into the netherworld that the vengeful Heike spirits occupy, neither fully in this world nor in the next. The transition effect is produced on the optical printer, and for Hōichi it looks as if they have pulled a mat or mask without getting by design a fully clean extraction so that elements of his outline remain visible. We had a lighting change that accompanied the transition with spotlights that were brought up on the samurai in the rear room. This customary high angle from Kobayashi accentuates the two-dimensional effect of the oblique projection produced by the skewed camera angle. In the Hearn story, the action in which the samurai wrenches off Hōichi's ears is described very quickly and without much embellishment. What Kobayashi is going to show us is far more brutal than the description that Hearn provided. The samurai's motivation is the same in both places, in the story and in the movie. He wants to show his superiors that he's discharged his orders as assigned. But in the movie, all of this becomes much more physical. We see Hōichi suffering in detail, and so it acquires a force that it just doesn't have in the Hearn story. His suffering is contrasted with the pitiless face of the samurai ghost. Most of the scene plays without natural sound, as a silent display accompanied by Takamitsu's electronically distorted musique concrète. But then as it ends, the track is going to switch to natural source-connected sounds, and we will hear Hōichi's whimpering and distress. And there's that pitiless face. Slowly moving camera follows him as he crawls onto the veranda, blood streaming from his ears. Now the natural ambient sounds, source-connected sounds, return to the sequence. And we go out of the scene with a pair of Kobayashi's reciprocal camera moves, in toward the bleeding Hōichi and out from the well in the temple grounds and the red-tinged sunrise. We've seen this framing before of the rear gate and the well, used to signal the presence of the ghost. Now the pullback by the camera has prepared us for the blood trail that leads to the back gate. Kobayashi reverses the perspective to show the priest and the acolyte entering the temple here, and then we have a detail that is very different from the Hearn story. We get a traveling shot that shows us all of the blood that Hōichi has shed. There is almost no attention to Hōichi's bleeding in the story. The camera move comes to a stop at the biwa, which is an interesting point of punctuation because it reminds us of Hōichi's ability to use music to channel the other world. Our comical characters return. And they get a little narrative here about what's happened and are appropriately disgusted. That's a great detail there. The bloody handprints on the wall are not in the Hearn story, and they're a splendid visual detail that vividly points to Hōichi's agonies as he staggered and collapsed against the wall. And then we get this memorable close-up with naturalistic sound that evokes his distress and suffering in very concrete terms. Some more comic interplay with Yasuko and Mosaku, and a slight push-in on them as they tease one another. This comical business leads into the priest's commentary on Hōichi's loss of ears. Given the level of violence and suffering that Kobayashi has shown us, the priest seems rather circumspect about Hōichi's fate and his own culpability in it. A little more hands-on attitude and follow-through from the priest might have avoided Hōichi's fate. As he says, ears don't grow again. But the sequence allows Kobayashi more opportunity to show off the Buddhist statuary that he really loves. There's a good shot showing Shimura and how robust he looks in this movie. Very much like he did in Seven Samurai. And that's surprising because in the Kurosawa films from this period, he doesn't look like that at all. He looks very frail and sickly in pictures like Yojimbo and Sanjuro. This overhead shot of the procession is another point where Kobayashi references the two-dimensionality of the scroll paintings and the oblique projection of orthogonal lines. The abrupt cut to this close-up is a very calculated change. The shallow focus and close view isolates the character from his surroundings and makes it hard to connect what we see with the preceding shot. Kobayashi introduces some ambiguities that are not found in the conclusion of the Hearn story. In the story, the narrator simply tells us that Hōichi became famous and many prominent persons came to hear him play. In the film, these visitors might be ghosts. Yosaku and Musaku tell Donkai that they cannot tell whether the visitors are real or not, and I think we have some of the same difficulty. Is Hōichi continuing to channel restless spirits from the next world? That's a question Kobayashi places at the end of this episode. It's not there in the Hearn narrative. This familiar high-angle framing of the retainers transitions with a tilt to the dramatic sight of the noblewoman in the red robe descending the stairs. The no chanting that we are hearing heightens the presentational qualities of the action, making this segment of the episode a little different from the more representational style that we've seen earlier. So we've got a very theatrical presentation here that reprises the stylistic inflection we saw earlier, In the recreation of the Battle of Dan Nora, in both sequences, the markedly presentational style distances us from what we're seeing and points to the presence of a ghostly dimension. Donkai tries to warn Hōichi not to play for these mysterious visitors, but Hōichi's trauma and disfigurement seem to have placed him into a new state of consciousness, which is marked by his change of costume. He's no longer so abject and submissive. He's acquired a certain poise and confidence, and he is resolved now to make the biwa his calling and his mission. While he has always been a biwa-hoshi, now he embraces the exorcism component that this calling has thrust upon him. He's no longer naive about the power of his music or about the realities of the spirit world, and he does not fear either. This shot stresses the hierarchical nature of the assembly and the rigidity of the social stratification that defines the power dynamics that are in play. The shot of the noblewoman and her retinue defines them visually in terms of their black hair, a motif that points back to the previous 2 episodes in the film. And now we get a camera move in on Hōichi that ends with a close-up of the biwa and plectrum. And then an overhead panning shot of the temple grounds that shows the gifts and offerings that the growing number of visitors have been bringing with them. Camera move pulls back here to enlarge our sense of the gifts and offerings, the newfound wealth of the temple. As the narrator explains that Hōichi has become wealthy, we travel a final time through the grounds and toward the back gate, with cherry blossoms lining the sides of the pathway, a Buddhist symbol of life's transient nature. This is a lovely traveling shot. It's not in the short version of the film. There we simply have a freeze frame of this location. Perhaps the temple graveyard lies just beyond, with the gate marking a boundary between this world and that of the spirits. The camera move takes us closer to that boundary. A visitor to both worlds, Hōichi has been marked by this encounter, and perhaps if this Kwaidan has been effective, so have we. This final episode is the strangest one of all and the most self-conscious in that it spotlights the active narration of storytelling. Kobayashi makes some interesting structural changes to this episode. The opening sequence differs from the Lafcadio Hearn source by introducing 2 time frames, whereas in the Hearn story there is only 1. We see men crossing the frame in dark kimonos, and when the camera pans right, we see a pulled rickshaw sitting idle. The year 1899 coincides with the period that Lafcadio Hearn lived in Japan. He published the collection In Ghostly Japan in 1899, and this story, In a Cup of Tea, appeared in the collection Koto, being Japanese curios with sundry cobwebs, published in 1902. So maybe the writer that we see here working at his table could be a Japanese surrogate for Hearn. This character does not exist in the Hearn version of the story.
あるいはまたその執筆の途中で死の神が筆を止めさせたのかもしれない。とにかくなぜ結末がないのか誰にもわからない。だが私はあえてそれを
After we are introduced to the writer, the second setting is identified. It will be the Tenwa era. Farther back in time, this too would correspond with Hearn's situation in that the ghostly tales he wrote about had been passed along in oral traditions and were written down long before he arrived in Japan. As we come into this scene at the temple in Hongo, Takamitsu introduces an oral motif that indicates the presence of the spirit world. It sounds a bit like the buzzing of bees, and he might be using a lute or other kind of 3-stringed fretless instrument to produce it. It sounds as if he's passing a bow along the strings rather than plucking them, and then electronically altering the octave and pitch so that the sound becomes almost a subliminal presence as the scene opens. Well, he should have stayed where he was. No doubt it's not much fun sitting outside in the hot sun, but this impetuous fellow is going to regret getting up. Takamitsu increases the volume of the buzzing sound to announce the strange apparition in the cup of tea. And we have a very striking deep focus shot here of a kind we haven't seen a lot of in the film, with things arranged in the near foreground, midground, and background to accentuate depth perspective in a way that differs from the compositional strategies that Kobayashi's used throughout the movie. And these two very low-angle shots are different from what we've seen earlier. So these changes in compositional style, like Takamitsu's score, mark the appearance of the weird and the uncanny. Hearn writes that the face in the tea looks young and beguiling and almost feminine, and Kobayashi presents actor Noboru Nakaya in a way that is very consistent with this description. The face is both threatening and inviting. Kobayashi completes a diagonal move into the samurai, and the low-angle framing with the jagged bamboo fence posts suggesting an incipient violence. The cutaway here, placed between these two shots of the samurai, softens the change in screen direction, the samurai facing screen left, then facing screen right, in this other very deep focus shot. The change is still striking and subtly disorienting, however. Kobayashi is doing a number of things to disturb the spatial integrity of the scene and make us feel off-kilter, rather like the samurai. Now he pulls out all the stops: extreme low-angle shot, canted, lurching perspective. The face appears right side up for the first time, making it seem more invasive. A brief return to stability in this high-angle shot. And then a fabulously expressive camera move as the camera pivots around to the left on its Z-axis. Here it is. Fantastic. And then a shot series that intercuts progressively closer views of the face with low-angle views of the samurai, in which his spatial orientation changes, lurching to the left and then the right and then to the left. And then when he finally drinks and slurps down that threatening soul in the cup, Takamitsu makes sure we hear that action, since it will carry such grave consequences. The flirtatiousness of the face in the cup, its smile is virtually a come-on, is part of what makes it seem so uncanny and so inexplicable, and doubtless helps to provoke the samurai into his heedless action. Perhaps it is the suggestion of a sexual overture that provokes the samurai. Homosexuality was a coded and ritualized aspect of the samurai world, but it wasn't licentious and promiscuous, and the way this spirit seems to be flirting could perhaps be considered a transgression. Kobayashi makes that rather bland passage in the Hearn story into a virtuoso scene, filmed with great imagination and expression. Let me say a little more about the lurching, pivoting camera move that stands out in the sequence. We saw a similar move during the climax of the Black Hair episode. The movement is related to the action of panning and tilting in that the camera head pivots on a stationary axis, whereas in a true traveling camera shot, the whole camera, head and base, moves through space from one location to another. In a panning shot, the camera head pivots around a stationary vertical axis that is parallel to the picture plane. In a tilt, the camera pivots around a horizontal axis parallel to the picture plane. The optical movement in those kinds of shots feels very stable because our visual orientation to the ground doesn't change. But it does change in the way that Kobayashi uses these special distorting movements. The camera pivots around the stationary axis that is orthogonal to the picture plane. That is, the axis is at a right angle to the picture surface, and that's why it seems so dizzying. It changes the angle of the ground plane, which is normally fixed, and gives us our sense of a stable spatial layout. So it's a very effective technique for creating disorientation. It makes the world real before our eyes. You don't see it used often in cinema, and Kobayashi has used it judiciously and very effectively. The clock in the private chambers here is a kind of portal to the other world and a manifestation of the malicious spirit of Heinai. The cup is a manifestation of his anxieties. A nice push in on the samurai, suggesting that something is approaching. And then from this close-up of the cup, Kobayashi cuts directly to the clock, and then to a reverse angle overhead shot that aligns the clock with the cup as a portent of the uncanny. And when Heinai appears, time stops. The clock ceases to function. This superb composition graphically matches the outline of the ghostly Heinai with that of the clock and its shadow. A light behind Heinai to silhouette him. Is he somehow a projection of the mechanical timepiece? The composition reprises the film's earlier suggestion of a relationship between the uncanny and the time frame of a historical era. When he comes forward, the intercutting between Heinai and the samurai continuously frames Heinai with the clock in the background. There you can see it. And this reprise of his face in the bowl repeats the image of his provocatively flirtatious leer. And then the shot dissolves into a similar expression on Heinai's face as he confronts the samurai in the apartment chambers.
拙者見覚え申さん。それにしてもこの屋敷へいかようにしてお入りなされたか。お聞かせを願いたい。
ああ、そこもとはそれがしを見覚えなしと仰せられるのだ。
ご面識の覚えござらん。まして諸侯の邸内、昼夜の警護に許しなき折から、取り次ぎのものもなくお通りなさるる道理がござらん。
Kobayashi's compositions continue to associate Heinai with the clock.
本朝それがしに非道な機会をお加えなすったではござらんか。
The cut to this shot places the clock within a frame within the frame. It suggests Heinai's continuing presence in the room, and when he reappears, both figures are oriented toward the clock, with the samurai staring at it in a lingering way. And now when he turns, Kobayashi holds the framing, and Takamitsu's score insists on the clock's presence. And then, nicked by the sword, Heinai makes his exit by going back over to the clock and entering the opening in the shadow cast by its mechanism. The action suggests that the clock is a kind of portal to another dimension for Heinai, a fixed point through which he can pass into and out of this world. What does this ghost or spirit want? How and why did Heinai's soul become disconnected from his body? We don't get answers to these questions, which makes this tale the strangest and most uncanny of the bunch. The other spirits had motives for their actions, and even the Yukionna, whose motives are somewhat more mysterious, is a very familiar figure of folklore which helps to contextualize her behavior. But Heinai's inscrutability, his insistence that the samurai has wounded him, a claim that is difficult to comprehend, makes him seem more sinister, capricious, and cruel than the other spirits in the movie. As such, he manifests the special feeling that this tale is meant to convey, according to Lafcadio Hearn. It's the feeling you get when you're walking on a dark staircase at night and suddenly you realize that your next step is suspended over a void, that there's nothing there, the stairs are gone, and only blackness and emptiness faces you. The abrupt encounter with nothingness dissolves the outline of one's world, as Heinai's apparition has dissolved the world the samurai has believed he inhabits. While the samurai sounds the alarm to the other guards, let's take a moment to remark on the rather extraordinary historical prop in this scene, the mechanical clock, which does not exist in the Hearn story. Kobayashi has added this detail, perhaps to identify time with the uncanny, as he has suggested earlier in the slippage between the two period settings that opens the episode. The first Western mechanical clock appeared in Japan in 1551, and the warlord Nobunaga Oda, who nearly unified Japan, had one a few years later. Ieyasu Tokugawa, whose shogunate launched the 200-year Tokugawa dynasty, had a mechanical clock in 1606. These were gifts of Spanish missionaries and officials. Missionaries began teaching clockmaking in Japan, helping to disseminate the skill. Before the Meiji Restoration of 1868, when the fixed hour system in the West was adopted, mechanical clocks were cumbersome because day and night each were defined by 6 hours of equal duration. Numerical designations ran from 9 to 4, counting down from midnight. 1 to 3 were not used as designators because their use clashed with religion. Buddhist temples struck their bell up to 3 times. Thus, the mathematics of timekeeping was subordinate to spiritual belief systems. Day ran from dawn to dusk, and so the units for day were not equal to those of night, and seasonal changes produced more variation in the length of temporal units. The solution to this was to design clocks with different dials for the seasons and with the ability to vary the speed at which the hands moved. In a sense, this was a pre-scientific approach to measuring and marking time. And Kobayashi may be drawing a connection between this spiritually determined approach and the force and presence of the uncanny. Clocks and ghosts often are connected in folk tales and in reports of psychic and paranormal phenomena. The sound of a ticking or chiming clock where there is no clock, or the stopped hands of a clock, commonly signal the presence of a spirit. So too does the presence of a clock without hands. In some tales, clocks themselves are haunted or demonic, striking the hour only when someone dies. Time itself can be haunted. Spirits and apparitions often appear at an appointed hour, as in, for example, Dickens' story, A Christmas Carol. This anthology movie is a little bit different from the way they're made today. It's common with anthology pictures today to have a kind of wraparound story to unify things, but Kobayashi doesn't do that. In some ways, it's not really a linear film. Each story is distinct from the others, and they could be reshuffled around in different orders, and they don't really need to be watched all at once even. You could watch one or more episodes on a given evening and then come back later on. So it's an interestingly different approach to making an anthology picture. And I think it probably corresponds to the collections of Kwaidan as they were finally printed, right? I mean, you would pick and choose and read some and not others. Now at the chambers is the great actor Seiji Miyaguchi, who's best known for his incredible performance as the mysterious Zen swordsman in Seven Samurai. He was also very memorable in a brief appearance as a gangster in Kurosawa's Ikiru. Miyaguchi appeared in more than 100 films, and Kobayashi used him quite often. Miyaguchi appears in Kobayashi's Black River, where he plays a communist who's living in an apartment tenement. He can be found in The Human Condition and Kaseki, and he gives a fantastic performance in The Inheritance, Kobayashi's scathing portrait of materialism. The two began their association on the 1951 production Fireworks Over the Sea, on which Kobayashi served as an assistant director under Kinoshita. So Miyaguchi is a familiar face in Kobayashi's work, and it's always good to see him. With the arrival of the three visitors, Kobayashi's camera work and compositions become exceptionally expressive. This shot opens with a composition that has pronounced depth perspective. And then when the samurai rounds the corner, the camera travels with him down the corridor to the next corner, where he pauses, concerned about an ambush or other troubles. The character's stoic demeanor and his very cool reactions to the strange things that are happening set a tone that Kobayashi changes to great effect in a few moments. So he pauses at the entrance, and the camera pulls back to reveal the three strangers wearing woven hats, whose curves create a pleasing graphical contrast with the straight lines of the architecture. When they introduce themselves, the camera pans in an unexpected way from the center figure to the right-hand one, then back across the center figure to the left-hand one. It's a counterintuitive series of panning movements. We'd expect a single pan across the group in order from one side to the other, not the reversal of direction that we get. Kobayashi uses this strange set of panning movements to create a disordered spatial design, keeping us off balance about the visual layout of the scene and positioning and connection of the characters. And this will become more developed as the scene progresses. It's as if the visitation of these spirits has torn through the fabric of space that contains the physical world our senses can perceive. When the samurai attacks, Takemitsu uses a futozao played in a discordant manner to replace many of the natural sound effects. And it's been electronically distorted and the notes clipped and edited to enhance its strangeness. A nice ghostly effect. The camera has panned away from the empty entryway, and now when it pans back, the trio of spirits is standing there. Note their positioning. The green one is on the right side of the group. Kanai comes forward, and a moving camera shot approaches the trio. When he charges them and tries to use his sword, the middle figure in orange vanishes, and then we get a reverse field cut in which the trio has reappeared. Note now that the figure in green is on the left side of the group, and in a reversal of the previous design, a moving camera shot pulled away from the group. These appearances by the trio of spirits are mirror images of each other. The uncanny forces have ripped a seam holding spatial reality together. Time and space start to behave erratically. The appearance of the spirits has rearranged the coordinates of perceptible reality. Kobayashi reprises his emakimono style of composition with this bird's eye view in which the lines of architecture make oblique angles in the frame. We've lost all ambient sound, despite obvious visual markers like the blowing foliage. When he runs toward them in slow motion, it's as if we are seeing him from outside of his world. We see him from a domain where the laws of time and space are very different. They have an alternative magnitude and frequency. As if in a dream, he cannot close on the spirits. In this reverse angle cut from his point of view, he recedes from them instead of drawing closer. Physical reality has become elastic and surreal. The spirits have dissolved the fabric of reality, and Kanai's actions no longer have their expected consequences. As the sequence draws to its close, the visual perspectives drawn from the empirical world and from the spirit world are projected on top of one another. Kanai moves in slow motion, and then at normal speed, the spirits flit around him as shadows which he can see and which he tries to attack. But they can also be glimpsed as swiftly moving solid forms at the edges of vision, which we can see and he cannot. Throughout, the camera's perspectives are canted, off-center, lurching. When he does manage to hit them with his lance, making physical contact for the first time, they lose their ability to move through the envelope of the material world, but only momentarily. You get these nice freeze frames as he seemingly dispatches each one. But then in this bird's eye view, they reappear as Kanai goes insane. His laughter turning to gibberish. And Kobayashi achieves a splendid contrast with the stoic, locked-down demeanor that the samurai had displayed earlier. The samurai's insane laughter bridges the centuries. It overlaps the transition to the writer's apartment, suggesting that the great cosmic joke or curse of souls dislocated from their bodies has been passed down through the ages. proof of which we are about to see. So we've seen this location before. Kobayashi has used it to establish the two time periods that the last episode is occurring in. And these are two characters that are introduced now in the sequence, and they're played by very notable actors. On the right there is Haruko Sugimura. She was best known for playing characters who were often kind of brittle, embittered wives and mothers. She was best known for the numerous Ozu movies in which she appeared, including Late Spring, Tokyo Story, The End of Summer, and An Autumn Afternoon. She worked for Kurosawa in No Regrets for Our Youth and Redbeard, and for Mikio Naruse in Summer Clouds and Flowing. Kobayashi cast her again in Kaseki. On the right there is Ganjiro Nakamura, also a fixture of Ozu movies like Floating Weeds and The End of Summer. He worked as well with other major directors, Kon Ishikawa's Odd Obsession and Conflagration, Kurosawa's The Lower Depths, Naruse's When a Woman Ascends the Stairs, Shohei Imamura's The Pornographers. So we've got two very prominent actors coming in here at the very end of the episode. It makes for a little flourish or exclamation point, and they bring with them the long association that their personas have established in the classic films by these other major directors of Japan's golden age.
この結末を私はいろいろに想像することができるが、諸君に満足を。
So the narrator resumes with material that's taken from the Hearn story.
人の魂を飲んだ。
This, in fact, is where the story ends, although, as I noted before, there is no writerly character in the story itself.
人の魂を飲んだ者は。
She gives a great scream there. And Kobayashi's giving us a very nice lead-in to the film's final moment of the uncanny. A very theatrical lighting effect concentrates our attention on the urn. Nakamura gradually approaches it, and you can see how the lights come down, and we have a spotlight here, creating interest and anticipation. When Nakamura looks into it, Kobayashi's reveal of its contents provides a fitting emblem for the entire film. The camera moves gradually over to the urn, building our sense of anticipation about what has driven these two characters out of the room. And when we look into it, we see the writer's disembodied soul beckoning to us from the spirit world, inviting us to cross its threshold, and reminding us of experiences and realities that lie beyond those things that we can see and know. The ending also foreshadows what awaited Kobayashi. Kwaidan nearly bankrupted him, and he was let go by his studio. Though he continued to make significant films, he worked less frequently and had many scripts turned down and projects he could not fund. He tried for more than 10 years to make a dream film about the Silk Road. It was never to be. And so Kwaidan's closing images of the writer's empty chamber and the work interrupted and uncompleted has a resonance that Kobayashi probably did not anticipate when he made this lavish film.